Did you know that GBA connectivity almost had a bigger role in Wind Waker? Or that Olimar's wife was abusive? Or did you know that Mario Party was never actually intended to be a series? Lately, we've been crawling through hundreds of Japanese magazines looking for interesting tidbits to translate, and that's where pretty much all of today's info came from. We stumbled upon a few interviews for GameCube games during our research, all of which were bursting with facts we'd never heard before. So unless you speak Japanese or lived in Japan in the early 2000s, you probably haven't heard any of the stuff in this video. Today we're going to focus on facts from a few GameCube titles like Wind Waker, Pikmin 1 and 2, and a couple Mario games. So let's jump right in with a roundtable interview we translated all about Wind Waker from Japan's Nintendo Online magazine, their January 2003 issue to be exact. This interview is in two parts, with the first half featuring Wind Waker's director Eiji Aonuma, and key members of the game's audio team like composers Koji Kondo, Kenta Nagata, and Hajime Wakai, as well as sound effects programmer Masafumi Kawamura. The interview opens with a few things we've already talked about on the channel before, like how Aonuma thought about using a theremin as the game's main instrument, instead of a conductor's baton. After Aonuma mentions how they strived for high-quality, realistic audio, the interviewer asks if the team used actual seagull cries in their sound design. This is where Kawamura joins the conversation and starts bringing up details we've never heard before. He says, "It's actually not a seagull in the game. We tried using one at first, but it didn't really sound like a seagull, so we used altered elephant sounds. We also tried out a lot of other options, like mixing crocodile, camel, and lion sounds. For reference, this is what seagulls sound like in Wind Waker." We're not sure why a seagull doesn't sound like a seagull or how you turn elephant sounds into that, but it's all pretty impressive if you ask us. Then Kawamura mentions how they got a lot of their sounds from sound effect collection CDs, but that they do grab some of their own sounds out in the wild. "I wanted to record the sound of metal hitting a tree, so I hid a metal pipe in an instrument case and went out into the forest with it." He also adds that the sound of walking on sandy beaches were made by shaking a bag of potato chips. Take a listen. The team talks a little about how they were originally going to voice all the game's NPCs themselves, but it turns out they were, not good at it. Kawamura remarks that some of the staff gave good performances, and there were plenty of instances where they'd get good takes, but problems sprung up when they had to get recordings for unique situations. There were a few things where the staff gave good performances, but there are limits to what an ordinary person can do. Even if there's a script, it might just say "Oi," and even if you tell them to imagine yelling it out to someone 100 meters away, that's difficult for a regular person. Then the discussion falls to an important note about Wind Waker's development, that this is the first 3D Zelda game where Koji Kondo wasn't solely in charge of the music. In fact, Kondo helmed the music for basically every console Zelda game besides Zelda 2 up until Wind Waker. And with Kawamura, Wakai, and Nagata stepping up, they all decide to drop a little tidbit for us in the interview about what that was like. Kawamura says that before taking on the role, he'd heard that the only sound effect that carried over from A Link to the Past on the SNES to Ocarina of Time on N64 was the puzzle solved sound. So he made sure this was the only sound effect he carried over to the GameCube, to carry on the tradition, so to speak. This piqued our interest, so we went through every sound effect for both games, and although the puzzle solved fanfare is indeed the same, a bunch of other Ocarina sounds get reused in Wind Waker. The jingles for collecting a new item, opening a treasure chest, and collecting a heart piece are repeats, just to name a few. So if Kawamura's telling the truth here, some other devs carried over sounds too. Wakai says he didn't want to step up at first because he thought that if he helped make the game, he'd lose all the pleasure of playing it. Nagata, on the other hand, says he's always wanted to work on Zelda. And this part of the interview closes out with Aonuma talking about the power of music and how important it is to the feel of Zelda. He mentions that he's played builds of Zelda games in the past with no sound at all, and that it was actually painful and felt like the game might never be finished. But as soon as the audio's in, all that changes, and you understand the importance of sound. The next part of the interview centers on Aonuma and Toshiaki Suzuki, who led development on Wind Waker's GBA connectivity and the Tingle Tuner. Before Wind Waker, Suzuki directed a bunch of stuff, like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, Kirby Tilt and Tumble, and Super Mario Advance. But it's his work on Tilt and Tumble that caught Aonuma's eye. Basically, partway through Wind Waker's development, Aonuma realized he wouldn't be able to finish the main game if he spent much time on GBA connectivity, so he brought Suzuki in to take the reins. After the introduction, Aonuma jumps straight into a bunch of tidbits we've never heard before, like how the Tingle Tuner concept came from Miyamoto saying, "Zelda's a single-player game, but dads want to play too, right?" Aonuma continued, "That stuck in the back of my mind, and I wondered if we could actually make something like that. Then I heard about the Game Boy Advance and GameCube's connectivity. That's when I came up with a plan for how dads and kids could play together. There was actually a point when I thought about making this a major part of the game, but that would mean you couldn't enjoy it if you didn't own a GBA, so we settled on the balance we have now." They elaborate on this a little more, and seem to say they wanted to let folks control Link on the overworld map using the GBA from the beginning. And the focus on maps made them start thinking about Tingle, since he's a map merchant in Majora's Mask. Then Aonuma says, "At first we envisioned it as walking around holding Tingle inside the GBA like an insect cage, but Tingle's a character with a lot of popularity within Nintendo. Ultimately, we expanded his role to appear in the main game too, and eventually to the point that Tingle has his own island in the main game." The devs all had their own vision of who Tingle was, so they had to come together and establish what it was to be Tingle. Suzuki gives an example of how he casually made a red and white costume for Tingle, and then was surprised when another dev said that those colors weren't very Tingle-like, since he wears green clothes to imitate a fairy. In the final game, we see white, pink, and blue Tingles in the form of Tingle's brothers, but never a red Tingle. One of the most interesting Tingle-centric facts divulged in the interview relates to Wind Waker's huge max wallet size of 5,000 rupees, which is 10 times the size of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask's biggest wallets. Apparently, this huge wallet only came about thanks to Tingle. Tingle gives you bombs and items in exchange for money. We made the wallet incredibly big to accommodate Tingle. It's the biggest wallet in the entire Zelda series. The interview closes out with Aonuma saying how he thinks this will be the last time he works on a Zelda game. "I think this might be the last time I'm personally involved with Zelda. I've already squeezed out every last drop of an idea to the point that even if they told me to make a sequel, I couldn't." Seems he changed his mind, because he's basically worked on nothing but Zelda since, being credited on over a dozen Zelda titles after Wind Waker's release. Wind Waker has a fair amount of interesting behind-the-scenes info, but another GameCube title has even more secrets hidden beneath the brush: Pikmin. We recently translated Nintendo Dream's January 2002 issue, which has a great interview with Miyamoto all about Pikmin. And here he says that when he was a kid, he often engaged in quote-unquote cruel play. He'd put ants on a leaf boat and send them downriver. With Pikmin, he wanted to make a game where you can do that kind of thing virtually, and unlike most other video games, the creatures Pikmin kill aren't actually enemies. He says, "They're not really evil, they're just living their lives there normally. When you start the game, you think the creatures are evil, but as you progress, you think Olimar might be worse, and then in the end, you might think the Pikmin are actually the bad guys." It's a game where you can't make clear value judgments on the characters. He also mentions how Pikmin was almost a Nintendo 64 game, but the console was too underpowered. Then later, GameCube turned out almost overpowered. Quote, "We couldn't decide whether to make it for N64 or GameCube at first, but when we started testing it on the N64, we could only get 30 Pikmin moving on screen at a time. We thought it had to be on the GameCube, then we had 300 Pikmin moving around. Until recently, before release, we had 200 in-game, but it was hard to handle, so we reduced it to 100. In that same magazine, he goes on to say they thought about adding more puzzles but decided against it. This was because the game's opening shows Olimar's ship parts fall to the planet's surface, and it wouldn't make sense if they just happened to land on a bunch of puzzles. They also thought about every Pikmin having their own individual names and stats, but it would have been too taxing on the GameCube to generate all that data when a bunch of Pikmin popped out of an onion. They figured players would have lost track of their favorite Pikmin anyway. Like maybe you'd grow an affection for Red Pikmin Steve, but pretty soon you wouldn't be able to find him. After the game was finished, Miyamoto says they changed some details in the American localization, like Olimar's wife beating him. "We went through all the Japanese monologues to translate that Olimar quote, but it looks like it doesn't exist." Maybe Miyamoto was exaggerating, or Olimar's abusive wife was originally in the game but got removed, even in Japanese. We did, however, find that Olimar's wife isn't quite as sweet as you might have thought. She's depicted in a positive light in the English version, but in Japan, she belittles him. Olimar says, quote, "My wife is always saying I suck at precise work." Another log says she's quick to anger, but in the English version it was changed to say it's Olimar's boss who's quick to anger, instead of the old ball and chain. Olimar also has a dream where she's literally forcing pick carrots down his throat, which was toned down in English. For better or worse, his wife's dark side was left intact in the English version of Pikmin 2. Speaking of the sequel, we translated another issue of Nintendo Dream from a few years later, where the devs spend 8 pages talking about Pikmin 2's development. They show a clay figure from back when purple Pikmin had tails. It was originally brought to Miyamoto for his approval, but the tails ended up getting cut. They also say the purples were originally a dark green color, but changed them because co-director Hino wanted a Pikmin type who looked like eggplants. The devs go on to say Louie was originally called Luigi to sound like the English word loser, but they ultimately changed that too. The other co-director, Abe, says they also considered making it so the longer it took you to beat the game, the interest on the company's loan would accrue higher and higher. The day counter goes from 99 to 100, then up to 1000, then 10,000, and so on. Every time a digit's added, the numbers get smaller, and eventually they're too small to read. We spent an hour going to Sunset over and over to show you 100, but ain't no way we're doing 1,000. A lot of Pikmin 2's treasures got changed in localization, like Japanese corned beef getting switched out for Skippy peanut butter, and the batteries changing from a Japanese brand to Duracell. We already covered those in a dedicated Pikmin video 10 years ago, and the brands got removed from the Switch port anyway, but there's one treasure swap we still want to highlight. In this magazine, they say the picture inside the time capsule is one of the dev's dogs, Gonchan, but in the original Japanese version, it was Chi-chan, the cat who belongs to Mr. Yamaguchi, who made all the promotional clay figures. For the most part, in the Japanese version, they used branded items that maybe didn't exist anymore, but were commonplace when the devs were kids. This is because Pikmin 1 was especially popular with women of all ages, so for the sequel, they wanted to target dad's demographic, guys in their 30s and 40s who'd be nostalgic for those old Japanese trinkets that don't exist anymore. Basically, the developer's own demographic. Pikmin fans have long speculated that the lack of humans in the series meant they'd long gone extinct, and Olimar was exploring a post-apocalyptic Earth. But maybe that's not actually the case. In this magazine, they note that areas in Pikmin 2 are the altered versions of the first game's areas. When the interviewer asked why, co-directors Hino and Abe said, "The areas aren't exactly the same, but we intentionally made them look similar to give a sense of déjà vu that you've been here before. Like maybe it is the same place, but time has passed and humans have interacted with them." The house in Pikmin 4 also seems to hint that humans aren't as extinct as maybe we once thought. So what's the overall theme of the Pikmin series? According to the clay guy Yamaguchi, it's a message that applies to both the game world and the players' real lives. Even in a world as cruel as this, you can't give up on living. But what does the big cheese Miyamoto think? In the September 2001 issue of Nintendo Online magazine, he said, "On screen, Pikmin are constantly born and constantly dying. It's a deep game that really understands how the world is a cycle of life and death. An existential game with a determined undertone. That's the philosophy the Pikmin team wants you to take away, especially after the game's turned off and you walk outside to touch grass." Now we're going to take a look at something that drums up a little less existential dread. Some newly translated facts about Mario Party 4. The info here comes from Nintendo Online magazine's December 2002 issue, which has an interview all about Mario Party 4. Joining this time is the director of every Mario Party game up to this point, Kenji Kikuchi, as well as minigame director Shuichiro Nishiya, minigame designer Daisuke Takeuchi, art design director Yukinori Goto, and project coordinators Hiroshi Sato and Miyuki Hirose. Right off the bat, Kikuchi brings up how he never intended for Mario Party to become a series. It seems there were tons of ideas the devs had left over from the first game, so they pushed to make a sequel. Now here we are, 25 years and 18 games later. Mario Party 4's biggest change to the series was the entire game would now be 3D, so no 2D game boards. Early Mario Party titles on N64 had flat 2D game boards, but the power of the GameCube meant they could do fully 3D boards, and this drove much of the devs' thinking during production. To emphasize this, they wanted to add one dynamic 3D element to each board, which led to the inclusion of the roller coaster in Toad's Midway Madness. Mario Party 4 also introduces a mechanic where players can change their character's size to either tiny or gigantic using mini or mega mushrooms. According to Daisuke Takeuchi, originally when characters ate mega mushrooms, they'd become so big that their models were completely enveloping the board spaces. And conversely, according to Yukinori Goto, he wanted to make the tiny characters so small that you couldn't even see the models on the board. But they realized that was a pretty bad idea, so they made the characters actually visible. The team's approach to mini-games was just as bold. They went and asked every single member of staff at the company, regardless of job title or rank, to come up with ideas for mini-games. Many submitted full explanations of how a mini-game should work, but others just sent in simple doodles or sometimes even just a one-line memo. And once all the ideas were collected, it fell to Takeuchi to decide which mini-games to make. Some games came with highly specific requests, like in the case of the swimming minigame Mario Medley, where staff asked him to use the same camera angles as Olympic swimming. So Takeuchi went out and rented a videotape of the Olympics and asked the devs working on it to recreate what they saw on the tape. At this point in the interview, the devs are asked about a fan-favorite minigame, Book Squirm, and how they came up with it. According to Kikuchi, he just wanted to try making it from a technical standpoint, saying it's the kind of game you just have to make and see how it feels to have the pages falling down on you before you know how it works. While all the devs are talking about minigames, Goto brings up a pretty big element of the game that got left on the cutting room floor. He said, "We added in a lot of small objects since the GameCube can display them well, and we wanted to make use of that ability. At the first stage of planning, we had an idea to make the whole board a giant dollhouse, and what's left of that idea became the present room. The present room's where players can look at what they've won in the game's story mode, and it's pretty easy to see how all these designs might have once been a part of a big dollhouse game board." And just as a quick aside here, the description of Daisy's side table in the present room tells players not to peek at her journal. But if you want to ignore that bit of advice, you'll see that her journal is actually a Japanese copy of Mario Party 2. Another unique room in Mario Party 4 is the Extra Room. Takeuchi says the Extra Room is where substandard minigames go, and it came about after the team made the Beach Volley Folly minigame. It was so fun and engrossing that the devs would end up completely forgetting the game even had a board, and the matches would go on for ages. This is what Takeuchi meant by substandard, because it didn't fit the requirements for a Mario Party minigame, which needed to be short and sweet. But they didn't want to just throw the game away, so they made the Extra Room for minigames that could go on for a while. Project coordinator Hiroshi Sato believes that before they added in the Extra Room, the game wasn't up to snuff. They already had the tiny, huge size-changing mechanic and a bunch of other unique features, but the Extra Room was the final touch that made the game worthy of the title Mario Party 4. Back in our new N64 Facts Discovered video, a lot of folks really loved the insight and work ethic of Shugo and Hiroyuki Takahashi and their work on the Mario sports games. So today we're delving into another interview with the duo, all about the development of Mario Golf Toadstool Tour. The interview's from Nintendo Magazine's September 2003 issue, and features the Takahashis alongside sound director Masaaki Uno, and game coordinators Toshiharu Izuno and Kenichi Nishida. The article opens up with Hiroyuki talking about how one of the reasons they wanted to make Toadstool Tour was that the GameCube basically didn't have any full-fledged sports titles at the time, but they also wanted to right some wrongs with Mario Golf on the N64. They were super confident in Mario Golf and thought families would enjoy playing it together, but that didn't quite work out. After Mario Golf came out on N64, Hiroyuki saw children playing it in the toy section of a department store, but to his dismay, the kids just couldn't figure out how to play it properly. This is why Toadstool Tour has the auto shots, where the player taps the A button to determine the power, then the computer handles the rest. In fact, all the shots in the game can be performed by just pressing combinations of A or B, simplifying even technical shots. Apparently, this system took about half a year to think up and refine through trial and error. The overall goal for Toadstool Tour was to make a golf game that captured the essence of Mario, encouraged families to play together, and was user-friendly for beginners. But they needed to provide enough depth for enthusiasts and avoid leaning too heavily into fantasy, fearing that might detract from the golfing experience. However, they also thought if they made everything realistic, it'd strip away the Mario essence, so a lot of consideration went into harmonizing these elements. At one point, Shugo tried pulling in assets from other Mario games to see how they'd look, and recalls thinking it'd be a good idea to use the water from Super Mario Sunshine, seeing as how it had great-looking water for the time. but when he put Sunshine's water into Toadstool Tour, it didn't fit at all, and he had to rethink his approach. Masaaki Uno talks about how the struggle to strike a balance between fantasy and reality seeped over into the game's audio too. If we used real sounds for when a ball falls onto the lawn, it would get dull. So we tried using bubble wrap, and with the sounds of water hazards, we filled a bucket with water and poured it into a glass ashtray in the conference room. Shugo and I spent a long time doing it all by hand, and they even show us a picture of the same ashtray in the interview. The developers also decided to include jeers so that if it wasn't your turn, you could at least impact someone else's. Another reason for letting folks boo their friends was that Hiroyuki didn't like the idea of just taking his turn then staring blankly as the ball flew. He wanted everyone around him to join in at every possible moment, even if that means being heckled by other players. He went on to say that when people think of golf games, they kind of have this static image in their mind of a course and someone just lining up and hitting a ball. But when you golf in real life, the environment is much more lively and dynamic. The team went to great lengths to make the experience authentic, so much that they even brought in a pro golfer to test the game. Just as well because some of the staff had never even played golf. Kenichi Nishida told NOM, "I've never played golf, but playing this made me think that golf is fun. I'd like to try it."
We have some new and exclusive information in this video, so stick around until the end for some fresh facts. Now let's jump into a whole bunch of Nintendo game trivia. Pokemon Red and Blue need no introduction, having established what is now a mega multimedia franchise in the West. The earlier Japanese releases of the game, Red and Green, is where it all started, however. These earlier versions of the games have a variety of differences to the ones we got in the West, with a few references being lost in translation. The SS Anne had its name changed during its English localization, with the ship originally being called Saint Anne. This name may be similar, but the original Japanese name is actually a direct reference to one of Game Freak's earlier titles that predates the Pokemon franchise and their close relationship with Nintendo. St. Anne is a character featured in the Sega Genesis game Pulseman, and is the computer that actually creates the titular Pulseman. But more interestingly, and infamously, the Japanese versions include many bugs that are truly unbelievable and will have you wondering how the developers missed them. After setting off on their adventure, the player will eventually find themselves facing off against Sabrina, the gym leader in Saffron City. However, the player doesn't even need to defeat her in the Japanese games. Losing against Sabrina in these original versions still triggers the code showing that Sabrina has been defeated. When the player re-enters the gym, the text that is normally shown after the fight is displayed, and the player is rewarded with TM46, Psywave, as well as the Marsh badge. This bug was acknowledged by the team and fixed for the international versions of the games, as well as the Japanese version of Blue. Another bug exists in these early versions and is still present in Pokemon Yellow, both in Japan and internationally. An important early event in these games has the player getting hold of a Pokédex, but obtaining this item is reliant on a specific detail to the player's data, the number of Pokemon they have or have had in their possession. If the player has 2 Pokemon species registered to their data prior to obtaining the Pokédex of Professor Oak, which is tricky to achieve considering the inability to obtain Pokeballs until after the Pokédex has been received, then Professor Oak will not take Oak's parcel off the player, and will not give them this vital item in return. This can be achieved rather simply by grinding their starter Pokemon against various low-level monsters on Route 1, until eventually it evolves. This evolution will count as a second Pokemon having been registered to the game. This unforeseen oversight had damning consequences for the player, as without obtaining the Pokédex, the old man located in Viridian City will also not move, as this only happens after the Dex has been obtained, essentially soft-locking the game. Pokemon Yellow has another small detail that was easily missed by a number of players. It becomes evident at a certain point that the player needs some means of lighting their path forward after they encounter a cave. This can be done by obtaining HM05, which can be used to teach a Pokemon the move Flash, which is then used to light up the cave. However, there is another solution that relates to Pikachu. If Pikachu has learned either Thunderbolt or Thunder, talking to the companion will cause it to spark, briefly lighting the cave as a result. This isn't as effective as Flash, however, as it's only a very temporary instance of illumination. That said, it can be repeated indefinitely, allowing the player to traverse the darkness, albeit in a slow, arduous manner. Let's move on to another heavy-hitting Nintendo series that got a lot of love on the Game Boy, The Legend of Zelda. During a 2013 Polygon interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, the legendary designer was asked his thoughts regarding how Telltale's Walking Dead series was delivering installments of the game to players episodically. His response was that Nintendo had already experimented with the concept of episodic gaming way back in 2001. He stated, "When we first released The Legend of Zelda Oracle of the Ages and Oracle of Seasons on Game Boy Color many years ago, the original idea for those games was for them to be more episodic in content, and the development actually started with the notion of potentially trying to sell dungeons individually. At the time that we were working on the Oracle games, we felt that it just wasn't right to deliver a game in that fashion. But when we look at what we've done with the eShop and the possibilities that lie there, and particularly with the fact that we're able to patch now existing games that have already been released, that then opens up the possibility for downloadable content or adding new levels to a game that has already been released." Early material for the Oracle games can be found within the final game itself, containing a selection of musical tracks that went unused. This includes the music you're hearing right now, a rather smooth, jazzy number. This piece is rather interesting in its own right, as it seems as though, while it may have been unused in this instance, it was later repurposed slightly and transformed into the theme for the Mogmas in the future Zelda title, Skyward Sword. The Oracle games have quite a few regional differences too, and not just between Japan and the international releases, but even across different English releases. When Link makes his way to Holly's house through the chimney, naturally, she makes a reference to Santa Claus. It seems, at least in this instance, some of the team behind the game's European localization recognized that making this reference to Santa's existence in the Zelda universe would therefore mean that Christmas must also exist in some form within this world, and by extension, the Christian religion. As we've covered a multitude of times on this channel before, religious references in Nintendo games were also considered a major no-no for Nintendo, especially during this period. So this reference was altered to instead have Holly refer to Link as a chimney sweep. Another underrated Game Boy title is Donkey Kong Country, which had its own Game Boy Color release. This handheld game was published as Donkey Kong Country in the West, but its Super Famicom counterpart in Japan did not keep its original name when brought over to the Game Boy Color. On the Super Famicom, Donkey Kong Country was actually called Super Donkey Kong, and since this game was no longer a Super Famicom title, the Super in its name would have been an odd inclusion, as the prefix is used to denote the game present on the Super Famicom. Instead, this Game Boy Color game released under the name Donkey Kong 2001. A name change was probably justified anyway, as there are a fair few differences between the SNES and Game Boy versions of these games. One of which is an all-new level in the handheld game called Necky Nutmare, found in Chimp Caverns. The English name for this level is some standard Donkey Kong Country style alliteration, but the Italians went in an ever so slightly different direction and gave us a solid chuckle too. The Italian name for this level is literally Necky's Nuts. Marvellous. Changes were made to another portable Donkey Kong game as well, Donkey Kong Land 2. The Japanese version features a number of design changes to its levels which ultimately make the game slightly easier. In Bramble Blast, a section just prior to the star barrel has 2 blast barrels pointing to the bottom right. Internationally, this part also features 2 zingers. The Japanese release only has 1. In Parrot Shoot Panic, again, this is just before the star barrel, 2 zingers are entirely removed from the Japanese game. It's possible that the choice to remove these enemies was because of hardware limitation to prevent sprite overload from occurring, an issue that would come up in the international version if too many zingers were on screen during this section, which would have caused the DK barrel to not load in. Creepy Crow was also altered, where hitting the crow twice would make 2 hooks appear. In Japan, the top hook is now higher up, as well as the platform above. The rope climbing portion of the stage was also shortened to accommodate this moved platform. Donkey Kong Land 3 has some Japanese exclusive content too, a complete re-release of the game which never saw release internationally. Roughly 3 years after the original game's release, an updated version was made for the Game Boy Color in the year 2000 called Donkey Kong GB, Dinky Kong and Dixie Kong. A variety of minor alterations were made across the board compared to the original Game Boy release, with this version ultimately being released on the Japanese 3DS Virtual Console in 2014. Pokemon Puzzle Challenge and Puzzle League are fairly run-of-the-mill games released on the Game Boy and Nintendo 64 respectively, with the Game Boy game even including an animation in reference to the N64 release of Pokemon Stadium. Jinx's losing animation depicts nothing but its hair waving a white flag in defeat, in a similar manner to when Jinx is defeated in Stadium. Now, we've already brought up some unused data found in game code, but this one surely takes the prize as being one of the most unbelievable volumes of data that wound up being left unused. We say unused, but it can be accessed, but to say it's unlikely anybody did is perhaps an understatement. Within the game's data is nearly a fully fleshed out and finished game of Panel de Pon, the game that Pokemon Puzzle League is based on, with its SNES game having been localized in the West as Tetris Attack. We've mentioned in the past how the N64 game was based on Panel de Pon, and that there was an unreleased game that was reworked for the N64. But this is also true of the Game Boy game as well. To access the alternative game on the same cartridge, the player must attempt to boot the game on the original Game Boy or equivalent hardware. A warning screen stating that the game will only work with the Game Boy Color will appear, but by pressing A 24 times and then B 24 times, Panel de Pon will launch instead of Pokemon. It's also possible to do this with Game Boy Color hardware from the game's title screen. Get ready for this. The player must press up twice, right 4 times, down once, left 10 times, then up 4 times, right once, down 6 times, and then press B. This will load up the warning screen again, where pressing both A and B 24 times will launch the unreleased Game Boy Panel de Pon. We have some exclusive Pokemon trivia coming up later, so stick around for that. But until then, how about some Kirby trivia? Have you ever noticed that the cartridges for an original Game Boy game and a Game Boy Color game have a physical difference? Games released for the original Game Boy feature a small notch in their top right corner, but this isn't the case for Game Boy Color games. Well, this is true most of the time, but Kirby Tilt and Tumble is a unique outlier to this fact. While this game was released for the Game Boy Color and only works on a color system, the cartridge does feature a notch. The notch lets this Game Boy Color exclusive game fit in an original grey Game Boy. Even if another Game Boy Color game is put in an original Game Boy, it simply wouldn't boot because the notch is needed so that the power button can be slid into the on position. If the player tries to play Tilt and Tumble, however, a message will appear which reads, "This game pack will only work with the Game Boy Color video game system." It could be that the cartridges used for Tilt and Tumble were simply repurposed from another non-color game, possibly to save on costs and reuse old excess stock. It's also worth noting that you may have seen one of these "Game pack will only work with the Game Boy Color" messages elsewhere, as the GBC games can fit and boot up on the Game Boy Pocket, as that system lacks the notch mechanism. But Tilt and Tumble is the only color title that can be booted on an OG Game Boy unmodified. Nintendo games are great and all, but let's look at an often overlooked gem on the Game Boy Color, Metal Gear Ghost Babel. Ghost Babel, or just Metal Gear Solid in Europe, appears to have a character actually based on a real person that has seemingly nothing to do with the Metal Gear franchise. In the game, the character Brian McBride was an agent of the CIA and Director of Operations of African Affairs. The real Brian McBride, on the other hand, was an American soccer player. Metal Gear's McBride is an American in his 30s, and the real McBride was in his 30s when the game was released. The real McBride was also featured in Konami's Pro Evolution Soccer series, with Konami having, of course, developed and published Ghost Babel. The two also have distinct visual similarities, such as a strong chin and jawline and lines below their eyes. It's hard to say if this is just a big coincidence, or if someone at Konami liked the name and look of Brian McBride and wanted to use his likeness in-game. The Castlevania spin-off Kid Dracula had some changes made to its international release because of a symbol that could have been misconstrued. The game's first boss is depicted in the Japanese release with what some have referred to as a swastika on his forehead. However, this is not a swastika but a manji, a Buddhist symbol for balance which can represent love, mercy, strength, and intelligence. Because the symbol is often mistaken for its objectionable twin, the international version removes the symbol and the boss's hood has been reworked to look, well, less clanny. The aforementioned religious connotations were also part of why the game was reworked for overseas audiences. The tower in the game's intro was changed to remove this cross, as well as the bell, to remove religious symbology. Despite this removal, the sound of the bell is still featured in its introduction. Bonk is probably one of the lesser known platformers that has been a staple to Japanese audiences since its early days on the PC Engine. Bonk's Revenge on the Game Boy is a completely different game that shares a name with Bonk's Revenge on the TurboGrafx 16. The Game Boy title is yet another game that needed a few changes when it was brought to the West due to different cultural sensibilities. In the original version released in Japan, obtaining the Thief power-up would alter Bonk's appearance into something that could be deemed as eerily similar to typical blackface. Likely as a way to not cause offense, this was altered outside of Japan, with Bonk now looking like he's just broken out of prison instead. This next piece might be a bit odd, but it certainly gives us a glimpse into some very rare sprite work. Chris World was an in-flight entertainment system created by Singapore Airlines about a decade ago, with one of its major features being the inclusion of video games that were available to play through the Nintendo Gateway system, a service that put emulated games on flights and in hotels. In a commercial for this service, we can see a young child playing Super Mario Bros. Deluxe, the Game Boy Color port of the original Super Mario Bros. Mario pops out of the child's screen as a 3D model, but if we slow this footage down, we can actually see a single frame of a Mario sprite never featured in the game at all, with Mario facing the screen. It's arguable that a more popular Mario handheld adventure came in the form of Super Mario Land, a launch title for the system that introduced a variety of bizarre new elements to Mario. But this title's strange new world only helped establish it within pop culture. There's a few officially licensed Super Mario Land songs featured on the Super Mario Compact Disco album, and how this whole album came to be is quite the story. It's easy to assume that the album was commissioned by Nintendo of America. However, this is not the case at all. Instead, the track was a result of UK musician Simon Harris taking matters into his own hands. He was unable to get permission from Nintendo in the West, so he instead had to make his way to the boss on his own, going straight to Shigeru Miyamoto for approval and directly playing him a Super Mario Land rap song. He stated, "Nintendo UK didn't really exist at the time, and we couldn't get a whole lot of sense out of Nintendo of America. So, naively, we just hopped on a plane, flew to Japan, and made an appointment to see Shigeru Miyamoto. Luckily, he loved it." Harris would elaborate on this story further in a 2017 interview, stating that he first got approval from Nintendo UK for the Super Mario Land single before he wound up going over to Japan to get approval from Miyamoto for the album. While Super Mario Land had a number of oddities within the Mario series, it isn't alone. Bizarre things can be spotted through Mario's adventure in the game's sequel, Super Mario Land 2: 6 Golden Coins. In the game's ending, Wario loses his hat and is depicted as being bald, despite the fact he clearly has hair while he's wearing his hat. A Super Mario Land 2 manga explains away this oddity by revealing that Wario is indeed bald, but he has a wig attached to the inside of his hat. The manga also goes on to explain a pretty strange aspect of Mario Land 2, giving some context to the hippo statue found on the game's overworld that acts as an access point for the space zone, an area that has seemingly no relation to a hippo. The logic to this is that, of course, the statue was created to honor a hippo astronaut that was never mentioned anywhere in the game itself. Nothing screams 90s America quite like Wayne's World, and nothing screams 90s video game Easter eggs like hidden images in a game's code, especially when they can only be seen via convoluted and obscure passwords. While playing the game, holding start and pressing A, B, A, down, left, A, and then down, which spells out "a bad lad," will cause an image of the game's programmer to appear on screen. This devilishly handsome man clearly didn't want to take all the glory, as he also included a friend of his, visible by holding start and then pressing right A down, right B, right A, showing what it claims is an engineer at Radical Entertainment stuck inside a Game Boy. One final image can be seen in this same way, holding down start and pressing select A, left A, down, left A, select, select, spelling out Salad Lass. This will show a picture of Evie, likely the programmer's girlfriend. Scooby-Doo classic creep Capers did something similar to this, but perhaps with a slight bit of extra effort on the implementation part. Typically, the game's final cinematic will reveal the face of the game's main villain behind a spooky mask, as with any good Scooby-Doo ending. However, within the game's data is an unused script that alters this cutscene, revealing the true bad guys of this story to be the game's developers themselves. This unused cutscene cannot be accessed in-game without the use of hacking tools to modify the game's code, making it a pretty deeply hidden secret. Star Ocean Blue Sphere is another rather interesting game for the Game Boy. Earlier entries in the series were released on home console, and the Sony PlayStation at that. This was brought up during an interview with the game's designer, Tetsu Takeyoshiki, who explained why the game ended up on a Nintendo handheld. After Star Ocean and Star Ocean Second Story, it was decided that we would make Star Ocean 3 for the PS2. The question then became how to fill the gap while we waited for that project to begin. From the beginning, our plans were to make a compact game. But there is another interesting facet to this portable game. While in some cases there was additional content in cross-generational games which would work with an original Game Boy and Game Boy Color, this additional content was usually locked to those playing on the more powerful color hardware. In Star Ocean Blue Sphere, a cracked statue can be found in Gravis Desert. If the game is played on the Game Boy Color, there is no means of entering through this crack, but on the OG Game Boy, there is actually an accessible opening. Inside is a room with a character who gives the player the choice of opening up one of two chests, both containing rare power-ups, an unusual benefit for those using older hardware. Sticking with RPGs, one of the biggest third-party developers out there is arguably Square Enix, or Squaresoft during the era of the Game Boy. But having created some of the most popular JRPGs of all time, their other franchises weren't quite as well known in Western markets. The company released Seiken Densetsu for the Game Boy, renaming the title to Final Fantasy Adventure for North America in 1991. But the project wasn't always set for the Game Boy and was originally far more ambitious, starting life in 1987 for the Famicom Disk System. The Famicom Disk System enabled users to play games on rewritable and more economical diskettes, while still utilizing the power of the NES or Famicom. During this period of Seiken Densetsu's life, advertisements for the game were suggesting that the title would span an unprecedented 5 discs and would be a role-playing epic. Had this project continued, of course, it would have inevitably been one of the largest games ever made for Nintendo's 8-bit home console. Rumours have often floated around that there were former Squaresoft employees who have some form of prototype of this project in their possession, as well as early versions of Final Fantasy IV. But Moriyama has stated that there was never really any real progress made on this project at the time, and that these rumours were nothing more than hearsay. As LostLevels.org points out, the name was trademarked at an early stage, but the game never actually entered development. A 5-disc game was simply too ambitious, and the title was cancelled early on. From one mega JRPG series to another, Dragon Quest 1 and 2, as well as Dragon Quest 3 on the Game Boy Color, were localized into English by Nob Ogasawara, a name you might recognize as the man who also localized most of the early Pokemon games into English. Nob recently spoke about his experience working with Enix USA, which sounded amazing for all the wrong reasons. According to Nob, Enix USA were extremely cheap. Before their merger with Square, they operated out of a 2-story, 4-suite, cheaply constructed building, which also had a nail salon within it. The place had plywood doors and no reception space or counter, and was in a bit of a grungy area in North Seattle. Nob even described it as having all the charm of a hastily constructed war room in a former lumber warehouse. The company's deadlines were harsh and their pay was awful, but it seemed the staff had a decent amount of freedom as long as deadlines were met. However, it appears that Nob had to fight for basic changes to these games that were necessary to fit English text onto the tiny Game Boy screen. For example, Nob was told he needed to localize every item name into English only using 7 characters, which is somewhat understandable. But for items such as the Falcon Sword, this was obviously not doable. He was simply told to crunch the names down so it would be something like Falcon Sword, which frankly would have been a bit shit. Instead of making every dyslexic gamer cry, Nob came up with a solution of adding basic icons to the item names, so the Falcon Sword would be called Falcon with a sword icon next to it. Another ingenious space-saving method proposed by Nob was to add letters to the game's font table that had the apostrophes built in. Nob met resistance to both of these requests, but told Enix USA to just do it. Both changes made their way into the final games. And now for that exclusive Pokemon trivia we talked about earlier. Last year we translated an interview from the Japanese Nintendo Online magazine into English. The interview is from July 2000, and the interviewee is Takashi Kawaguchi, who was the producer on the original Pokemon games and worked on a bunch of other noteworthy titles such as Mother and Earthbound. Based on what Kawaguchi says in the interview, a huge part of Pokemon's identity comes from someone you might not expect. Despite usually being viewed as an empty suit, the Pokemon Company CEO, Tsunekazu Ishihara, actually changed the course of Pokemon's development early on. Back when Pokemon was just a bunch of designs and prototypes, Game Freak founder Satoshi Tajiri had other work he needed to take care of, and asked to pause production on Pokemon, which lasted about 3 years. It wasn't until development resumed that Ishihara would give the team some direction. Kawaguchi said in the interview, Ishihara was really into all kinds of card games, and I think he said something along the lines of, if we incorporate elements from card games into Pokemon, we can make something interesting. So it was those ideas added late in development by Ishihara that turned Pokemon into what it is today. These comments were echoed in another interview that we had translated, this time from the May 23, 2019 issue of Famitsu Weekly. In this interview, Pokemon's Junichi Masuda stated, "Yes, we received a lot of help as a company from Tsunekazu Ishihara, now CEO of the Pokemon Company, and Shigeru Miyamoto, now Nintendo Managing Director, who were both at Nintendo. Ishihara in particular was fond of card games and used that insight to advise on how to add more depth to the battle system. To be honest, things like the Pokemon types, the link cable battles, and the Pokedex were all added later in development based on his suggestions." It may come as no surprise then that Tsunekatsu Ishihara actually initiated the development of the Pokemon trading card game. This is likely why he got a cameo in the Pokemon trading card games on the Game Boy, appearing as the experienced collector, Mr. Ishihara.
Did you know? At one of the first development meetings for Luigi's Mansion 2, one of the devs pulled out a marker and drew a you-know-what on the whiteboard. The game was being made by Canadian studio Next Level Games, with Nintendo's Japanese devs overseeing their work. Staff from both companies were in the meeting, but nobody spoke anyone else's language. So doodling a chub was one Canadian guy's idea to break the ice. It was a bold and risky move, but luckily for him, it paid off. Everyone thought it was hilarious.
And then they all laughed.
They had a translator, of course, but the language barrier wasn't always easy to overcome. Sometimes the interpreter had to mime the movements Nintendo wanted Next Level to animate. For today's video, we translated some old Japanese magazines and interviewed developers to get the inside scoop on secrets, cut content, what it was like working with Miyamoto, and all sorts of behind-the-scenes tidbits for Luigi's Mansion 1, 2, and 3. Stuff like, have you ever wondered what Miyamoto's Mii looks like? When he visited Next Level HQ, everyone bought their 3DSs so they could street pass with him. Even devs from other companies showed up hoping to get Miyamoto's Mii living in their 3DS. One of the guys we talked to, Mark Brassard, showed us his mini Miyamoto. It looks just like him, doesn't it? We think he's actually cosplaying as Link. It's been 10 years, but Mark's still got him, and he says he'll keep him forever. But despite language and cultural barriers, all the devs we spoke to said Luigi's Mansion 2 was a fun game to make. Some said it was the most fun they had in their entire careers. Miyamoto literally told them to have fun. Next Level management was like, "Are you sure?" But Miyamoto insisted that fun development would yield a game that's fun to play. At first, Next Level was working on a top-secret Metroid game, the one we covered last year. But one day, they got a call from Nintendo saying to scrap it and make Luigi's Mansion 2 instead. Secrecy was top priority. They gave it the codename Green Onion so they could talk about the game without anyone knowing the series was making a comeback. They couldn't even tell each other about it.
It was very, very confidential. So for about like a year, there were only 4 people in this one room. It's like a mystery room with a key.
Uber, like, you know, like confidentiality, like closed room, no windows, like everyone on that project had a special card to get in that room.
And these 4 people would go into work and they would all go into this room and we didn't know what they were doing.
While those 4 guys were locked in the windowless room, they explored taking the series in a completely new direction. They went to Nintendo and pitched the idea of making Luigi's Mansion 2 more of a detective game. They also did some experimenting with Luigi's Mansion as a clone of Gauntlet, the classic top-down dungeon crawler. But Miyamoto was watching a lot of TV dramas at the time, so he suggested they follow the template of the original game, but in a more episodic format. The devs ended up watching a lot of Mr. Bean and essentially molded the game's humor and personality around it, with Luigi as the hapless fool and reluctant hero. Secrecy was so paramount, even Next Level's owners were kept in the dark about some things, like what system they were developing for. They thought it was going to be for the Nintendo DS, but one day they were flown to Japan where Satoru Iwata literally pulled a sheet off a table revealing, ta-da, the 3DS. Even after the team got a lot bigger, up to a team of 20 devs, they were still locked in a secret room with no windows, signing piles of confidentiality agreements and forbidden to tell their co-workers what was going on.
It was extra high security for that project. And because we were all so close together and it was so secret, it was kind of fun.
If Nintendo demands that level of secrecy for a handheld Mario spin-off sequel, you can imagine how locked down they keep even bigger projects. We've got more exclusive developer secrets for Luigi's Mansion 2 coming up, but it wouldn't feel right if we just skipped over the game that started it all. The development of the original Luigi's Mansion is pretty well documented these days, but there's still a handful of facts that aren't widely known, and some secrets that are unheard of, at least in the West. We found one such fact buried in the August 2001 issue of Japan's 64 Dream magazine, which we had translated for this video. This issue chronicles 64 Dream's coverage of E3 2001, the year Nintendo came out guns blazing and revealed their GameCube launch lineup, Luigi's Mansion included. 64 Dream managed to get some FaceTime with Miyamoto and got him to spill the beans on the upcoming games. He talked briefly about Luigi's Mansion's origins, and it seemed to be a long time coming. The staff had been long saying, "Mario again? We want to use Luigi." And we got those people together to start working on this game as something to play before the next Mario. But we still wanted to include Mario somewhere, and I suggested his hands could be sticking out from under a bed holding a box, but that was rejected. It seems initially the devs weren't quite sure how to work Mario into the game, but thankfully Miyamoto's suggestion was quickly shot down and they came up with something a little better than limbs under a bed. You've probably heard Nintendo experimented with stereoscopic 3D while developing Luigi's Mansion on the GameCube. It didn't pan out, but getting Nintendo bigwigs to embrace 3D became a decade-long push for director Hideki Kono. Yet Kono had some significant obstacles to overcome if he was gonna win them over. Nintendo still had a bad taste in their mouths from the failure of the Virtual Boy while making Luigi's Mansion, and there were doubts internally about stereoscopic 3D in general. The other big problem was 3D TVs were expensive at the time, so if Nintendo did produce a 3D screen for consumers, it wouldn't have been affordable for most people, and that's kind of the opposite of Nintendo's vibe. But Kono persisted and believed the tech would get better and cheaper. Kono would demo 3D again on the Wii, attaching a 3D panel to the system and making 3D demos of Mario Kart Wii, Animal Crossing, and Wii Sports to win over his colleagues. Kono told Edge magazine, "In Japan, there's a maxim. A glance is better than 100 words. Even with words, I wasn't able to convince anyone. So I presented the demo to Miyamoto and Iwata, and they were stunned and agreed to take it in that direction." This 3D Wii demonstration in part led to the creation of the 3DS, where Luigi's Mansion would finally be playable in stereoscopic 3D. So Kono's experiments with Luigi on GameCube eventually led to the creation of the 3DS, where those 3D experiments were finally realized. However, this isn't the only feature cut from the original game that ended up in the 3DS remake. The devs planned for the original game to have a multiplayer mode where Luigi met another Luigi. After Luigi's Mansion 2 was greenlit, both Kono and Miyamoto said the sequel absolutely had to include multiplayer, and it made its way in. Then, when the game released on 3DS, they made sure multiplayer was added to it as well. In the final game, Luigi can shine the dark light device to break illusions and see invisible objects. But the original idea was much more ambitious and would have divided the game into two separate realities, the normal world and the spirit world. The idea was inspired by the Dark World from Zelda: A Link to the Past, as well as Dark Aether from Metroid Prime 2. So there'd be a spirit world basically hiding behind every room in Luigi's Mansion 2, but the dark light device proved quicker and easier, so that's what they ultimately went with instead. Aspirations for multiplayer were aggressive, with Miyamoto saying he wanted fans playing it more than they played multiplayer Mario Kart. One mode was originally going to be called Tower of Terror, but Disney already had the name copyrighted for their theme park ride, so they changed it to Scarescraper. Or at least that's what it's called in the American version. In the UK version, it's called Thrill Tower. There was going to be another mode within Scarescraper focused on killing rats called the Pest Floor, but Miyamoto didn't like it, so he cut the Pest Floor in a single meeting. There was another multiplayer mode called Haunt and Seek that programmer Gary Shaw told us they spent a lot of time on, but unfortunately it ended up getting cut. Gameplay was basically online Pac-Man, where one player's Luigi collects keys and 3 others are ghosts who can fly through walls. Instead of a top-down view like Pac-Man though, it would use standard 3D camera angles, and there was a unique mansion instead of the traditional Pac-Man stage. Ghosts could steal keys and scare Luigi, while Luigi could stun them with his flashlight and suck them up with the poltergust. After Haunt and Seek got scrapped, a simplified version made its way to Nintendo Land as a minigame called Luigi's Ghost Mansion. One aspect of the game that saw a lot of cuts and reworks was its bosses. In an Iwata Asks interview back in 2013, director Bryce Holiday mentioned that the Haunted Tower stage wasn't always planned to have a stairway boss. It was originally going to have a plant-based boss that tied into the level's botanical theme, but Miyamoto thought that it was too ordinary and upended the tea table. That's kind of Miyamoto's thing. If he doesn't like how a game's progressing, he'll just tell devs to start over, a metaphorical table flip. So instead of a plant, Miyamoto suggests that they make a boss out of the stairs. So they did. In another interview with IGN, Holiday said Miyamoto's tea table upending went even further than this. At one point, he threw out all the bosses of the game and made us start over. From our angle, that was kind of a tea table flip. Thankfully, this was still early days, and the team hadn't started modeling most of the bosses yet. They'd only made one, and the rest were just concepts. Miyamoto felt that the bosses should be unmistakably Luigi's mansion in the player's eyes, so anything cliché or ordinary simply wouldn't do. Some bosses got tossed out multiple times, like the icy secret mine boss, which got tossed out about 4 times before the final design was made. Gary Shaw told us about one of these unused boss concepts, which was a mirror-based boss he said the team worked on for months. The player would have seen the boss through a mirror, but there was some asymmetry between reality and the reflection, and the player would have to exploit those differences to beat the boss. Gary couldn't remember the exact way you defeat the boss, but he thinks that you'd beat it by tricking it into falling off a cliff.
It's a clever, interesting idea, but in the end it just didn't work.
We mentioned earlier about Miyamoto's first time visiting Next Level. He visited their Vancouver office one more time, but things took a turn for the worse. The city's hockey team made it to the NHL Championship for the first time in 20 years, but they ended up getting massacred by the other team 4-0. Hockey fans started tearing the city apart, all while Miyamoto was there for his visit.
The riotous result left the city broken and burning.
One Next Level dev who wanted to remain anonymous told us that, unfortunately, the Canucks lost, and there was a riot downtown. Next Level's offices are right in the middle of downtown, and we were trying to get him around, and there was literally cars on fire like outside our office. I recall that being an issue at the office, making sure Miyamoto was okay in the middle of this city, on fire. All the windows were smashed around our office, cars were being flipped over. Needless to say, after that, Miyamoto wasn't especially keen to visit Vancouver again. But Next Level had proved themselves to Nintendo and were tasked with making another Mario game, Luigi's Mansion 3. This project was originally aimed at the Wii U. However, with the console failing to sell and Nintendo ultimately abandoning it, work was shifted to the Nintendo Switch and serious development began after Next Level shipped Metroid Prime Federation Force for 3DS in 2016. When Luigi's Mansion 3 entered pre-production, secrecy was back on the menu, with a few guys closed off in a small room for 2 or 3 years brainstorming ideas. Some of them didn't end up being used, but were pretty interesting. One unused idea was a sort of fast travel system where there's TVs all over the hotel and Luigi can warp into one and out of another. According to producer Kensuke Tanabe, this wasn't fully realized because they weren't able to put a TV in every room, so the mechanic ended up getting downsized to only existing on the 8th floor Paranormal Productions. Tanabe also said they'd been thinking about how Labo could be used, but didn't reveal how exactly. By the time the game came out, Labo was kind of on the way out anyway. Oh, and just as a brief aside, while researching this video, we found out that Luigi's Mansion 3's lead technical character artist, Jeffrey Zoern, was, get this, the art director for Hotel Mario on Philips CDI. Somehow, old Jeffrey managed to make the art for the 2 hotel-themed Mario games 25 years apart. Sorry, but we just had to mention that. Can you blame us? Anyway, the final game takes place in a 17-story hotel, and initially the devs thought about replicating the kind of hotels you'd see in Hollywood that have roller coasters running through them. But, quote, it did not ultimately get used. We wanted to make things even weirder, so we moved away from that. Despite them wanting to get even weirder with the concept, part of the reason that they set the game in a hotel all stemmed from something boring and monotonous: floor layouts. In most hotels, the layout of the rooms and corridors are the same no matter what the floor is, so room 202 is directly above room 102 and so on. Early in development, the devs thought about concentrating on puzzles that spanned rooms that were side by side. Then they realized a repeating floor plan would make visualizing an entire building a lot easier and meant they could also make puzzles that spanned rooms vertically, like across rooms 102 and 202, without much confusion. Tanabe gave an example of the kind of puzzles they were making via the Switch's Nintendo News channel, saying that if players saw water dripping down from the ceiling, they'd realize they should probably explore the room directly above them. Tanabe gave this example about 4 months before the game's release, so you'd probably expect his example, or something like it, to pop up in the game a few times. But the game we got was noticeably thin on puzzles that crossed floors, so what's the deal? Well, it turns out those kinds of puzzles are hard to develop and maintain, and they confuse players. Like we said, one of the reasons they decided to set the game in a hotel was to implement those kinds of puzzles, but it seems that the team bit off more than they could chew. At least that's the impression we got from the interview that this info came from. In the same interview, Holiday went on to reveal other aspects of the hotel that got cut, like ice and fire themed floors. One of the core principles the team held while developing Luigi's Mansion 3 was to make the game truly unique, unmistakably Luigi's Mansion, and all while surprising the players. But having generic ice and fire areas sort of flew in the face of that whole philosophy, so those floors were dropped. Speaking of surprising players, Luigi's Mansion 3 turned a few heads when fans found out it would have paid DLC. Nintendo announced 2 multiplayer DLC packs for the game, which inevitably led to speculation about single-player DLC. And since the game is set in a hotel and all, the devs could potentially add new floors, maybe as post-game content. Well, a few months later, Kotaku asked Tanabe if we would get new floors as DLC. Tanabe's response? He hadn't even thought about it. He elaborated, in Luigi's Mansion 3, it has a solid introduction, development, twist, and conclusion. Therefore, by inserting an additional floor, there would be inconsistency with the setting and chronological order, and we would end up restarting the story in an incomplete way, which the player would have already finished. Seems like Tanabe's biggest hang-up was how extra floors would impact the game's story and overall experience, which he echoed in other interviews. But the team at Next Level had a different view, at least for a time, and wanted to make a single-player expansion from the very beginning. However, this desire apparently faded pretty quickly, and they turned their attention to multiplayer DLC instead. Bryce Holiday told Kotaku, making story mode games is a difficult and slower process, development-wise, than multiplayer modes, so we ended up pushing multiplayer content to DLC. An additional benefit is that the cut single-player ideas can be saved for something else in the future. Something else in the future? Well, if all of Luigi's Mansion 3's content were made under the core principle of it being uniquely Luigi's Mansion, and the team plans on using cut content for ideas on a future project, should we be expecting a Luigi's Mansion 4? In an interview with GameSpot, Tanabe spoke a little about the creative process at Next Level, and just casually name drops a 4th game like it was something already on the docket. Even when I'm creating something, I'm constantly thinking about the next thing. Even as we're wrapping up development of Luigi's Mansion 3, Next Level Games is like, what about Luigi's Mansion 4? What's going to come after a hotel? And to be honest, making Luigi's Mansion 4 is kind of a no-brainer. If you look at the series sales, every new Luigi's Mansion has basically doubled the sales of the last. And there might even be more Luigi's Mansion projects on the horizon. Luigi was a prominent character in the 2023 Super Mario Bros. Movie, which as of the making of this video is the 16th highest grossing film of all time, earning about $1.4 billion globally. And the voice of Luigi in the movie, Charlie Day, has publicly stated his interest in doing a Luigi's Mansion movie with Nintendo on several occasions. In a comicbook.com interview in March of this year, Day was asked point blank if he wanted to do a Luigi's Mansion movie, to which he said,
Yes,
No, he
I
doesn't.
do, big time. You're not the first, but let's get that out in the zeitgeist. Let's make this happen, okay? I am in.
Did you know, in earlier versions of Donkey Kong Country, Cranky Kong was actually a nice old man and not mean-spirited at all. He'd say things like, "Diddy, you young pup, boy, I can't believe how much you've grown," instead of things like, "You wouldn't know a good game if you were in it." Another change is that the first level of the game, Jungle Hijinks, was originally named Jungle Japes. The name Jungle Japes was later used as the name of the first level for Donkey Kong 64. Donkey Kong Country 2 had its fair share of changes as well. It was originally going to be a Virtual Boy game. The Virtual Boy Boy version didn't get very far in development, only getting as far as a working title screen. Development shifted to the Super Nintendo when it became clear that the Virtual Boy was a flop. The German version of Donkey Kong Country 2's instruction booklet shows a character named Mr. X, along with some text stating no one knows him or has seen him anywhere before. Mr. X can also be seen on the front cover of the game's official German strategy guide and in issue 76 of Nintendo Power. Mr. X never appears in the game, and there are two theories as to why. The first theory is that he was intended to be a boss for the gloomy Gulch area but was replaced with Creepy Crow. And the second theory is that he's an unused earlier version of the enemy Cackle, as both have no legs, appear to be undead pirates, and have the same type of sword. The acclaimed Donkey Kong Country track Aquatic Ambience had trouble being implemented and might not have made it into the game. Composer David Wise was experimenting with ways to maximize use of the Super Nintendo's limited amount of RAM when making the track and ran into multiple issues. Wise said that the track was reprogrammed several times over the course of 5 weeks, but that it was ultimately worth the effort. The equally acclaimed Donkey Kong Country 2 track Sticker Brush Symphony was almost scrapped as well. The track was originally composed as a follow-up to Aquatic Ambience, but a decision was made to not include any serene water levels like what the first Donkey Kong Country had. The track was reused for the game's Bramble levels, and according to Wise, it seemed to fit and was a good juxtaposition to the difficulty in negotiating through such a hard stage of the game. During development of Donkey Kong 64, the team at Rare encountered a game-breaking bug. The game would randomly crash if played on a standard N64, but for whatever reason, the game would run correctly if the N64's RAM expansion pack was plugged in. Rare couldn't find a way to remove the bug and made the decision to ship a free RAM expansion pack with every copy of the game. This was the only way they could stop the glitch, and according to developer Chris Marlowe, it ended up costing them a fortune. There are also several changes during Donkey Kong 64's development. One of the changes is that the Kong's weapons were originally real guns, opposed to the comical fruit and nut-based weaponry seen in the final game. It's thought these changes were made to avoid controversy and ensure the game received a child-friendly rating. Early screenshots of the game also show that Donkey Kong's treehouse originally had a shower stall in it with a poster of Banjo and Kazooie on the side. Interestingly, Donkey Kong appeared on a picture in Banjo's house in the beta build of Banjo-Kazooie, but was replaced in the final version with an image of Banjo's sister, Tootie. Banjo-Kazooie and DK64 have more connections. The text Ice Key can be found in DK64's ROM. The Ice Key was one of Banjo-Kazooie's stop and swap items. This could mean Rare had plans of using the feature for Donkey Kong 64 as well as the Banjo-Kazooie games. The Donkey Kong 64 level Fungi Forest was originally planned as a level in Banjo-Kazooie. The level used to have the slightly different name Fungus Forest and wasn't implemented in Banjo-Kazooie because of time constraints. The level was finished and put into DK64 along with the level's original background music. The background music for DK Island also came from Banjo-Kazooie's beta, and the track was originally titled Lost. Part of the game's famous DK rap was later censored, a line of the song that refers to Chunky Kong saying, "But this Kong's one hell of a guy." The word hell was replaced with heck in later versions of the rap. One last piece of audio trivia for DK64 is that the game's composer Grant Kirkhope provided the voice of Donkey Kong. Nintendo have since reused the samples of Grant's voice in Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, Mario Kart Double Dash, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, the Game Boy Advance versions of Donkey Kong Country, and even an E3 demo version of Donkey Kong Jungle Beat. There's also a track in a Killer Instinct arcade promotional video that sounds almost identical to the track for Funky's Flight in Donkey Kong Country. Since the two games were developed around the same time, this either means that Killer Instinct borrowed the track from Donkey Kong Country, or that the track was originally intended for Killer Instinct. The opposite happened with Banjo Pilot, as it actually started off as a Diddy Kong game called Diddy Kong Pilot. It was reworked during development as Rare were acquired by Microsoft and no longer had the rights to use Nintendo characters. Early versions of the game even had playable Mario characters like Mario, Peach, Yoshi, Wario, Bowser, and Toad. The characters were removed in later versions and only Donkey Kong characters were playable. Rare had plans of including a character named Redneck Kong, but he was replaced with Candy. This was likely done to avoid controversy.
Did you know? The Japanese release of Donkey Kong Country has many differences from the international release, and these differences can be seen the moment you start up the game. The Japanese version has a completely redone title screen with artwork taken right from the Japanese box art. Unlike the international version's tiled title screen, which only allowed for a total of 16 colors per 8x8 tile, the Japanese title screen is rendered in an 8-bit color depth mode. This allowed for 256 colors on screen, resulting in a much higher quality image. This version also adopted changes to several enemies. In all other versions of the game, the Rock Croc enemies are invulnerable to any sort of move, but in the Japanese version, they can be killed by DK's hand slap attack when curled up into a ball. Interestingly, this would later be possible in the Game Boy Advance version of DKC. Another change is that it now takes Diddy Kong 2 hits to kill Manky Kongs. The first hit will make Manky Kong flinch with a single frame of his death animation, pushing Diddy back. Much like with the Clump and Army enemies, the Japanese version also has numerous changes made to levels, most of them making the game easier, with things such as extra DK barrels added and enemies that were either repositioned or removed altogether. A rather obscure change that was made is in the Blackout Basement level. The Japanese level stays dark for 46 frames and is illuminated for 77 frames, compared to the international version, which is 62 frames for both light and dark. These changes are extremely unusual, as it's often Japanese developed games that are made easier when brought to the West. The map icon leading to DK's treehouse is also removed in this version, likely because it seemed unnecessary as the player can't access that part of the map anyways. Donkey Kong also has several animations that went unused, including an alternate victory animation when he wins a bonus game or defeats a boss, and an attacking animation strikingly similar to the one DK uses in Donkey Kong 64. Cranky Kong has a walking animation that was scrapped but would later be recycled in the GBA remake of DKC. Cranky also has a large amount of unused level advice and would originally give tips for nearly every level in the game. While we're on the subject of Cranky, many fans are unsure about how he relates to Donkey Kong. This is mostly due to different contradicting sources. The Donkey Kong Country series states that Cranky is the current DK's grandfather, but in Donkey Kong 64, Cranky refers to DK as his lazy, good-for-nothing son, and it seems as though Rare wanted to maintain consistency with this statement, as one of the head writers of the game, Lee Loveday, stated that the current DK is in fact Donkey Kong Jr. grown up, and any statements that say Cranky is his grandfather were to be ignored. Though given Lee Loveday's sense of humor, some fans aren't sure whether to take this seriously. Dinky Kong would later become Kiddy Kong's Japanese name, and much like Diddy, Kiddy went through several different names before his was finalized. Some of the names suggested were Baby Kong, DJ Kong, and Tiny Kong. The name Tiny Kong would be given to another Kong character introduced a few years later. At the time of Microsoft's acquisition of Rare, the studio had 3 known Donkey Kong games in development. As Rare no longer had the rights to use Nintendo characters after the buyout, all 3 games were being retooled to feature Rare's own IPs. Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers became It's Mr. Pants, and Diddy Kong Pilot became Banjo Pilot. But the one title that never saw a release in any form was Donkey Kong Racing. For over a decade, information about this game was limited as it didn't get very far in development. But recently, a number of details have surfaced about it, as well as its retooled iteration, Saberman Stampede. In February 2014, a NeoGAF member under the alias Shiggy posted several pieces of artwork from unreleased Rare titles. 2 of these games were Donkey Kong Racing and the game DK Racing was turned into, Saberman Stampede. The concept art for Donkey Kong Racing reveals that Cranky Kong and Lanky Kong were going to be playable characters, and that traditional go-karts were considered at one point during development. Almost 2 weeks following the artwork leaks, more information about these titles were released in an interview with former Rare employee Lee Musgrave, who was the lead designer for Stampede and who also created Donkey Kong Racing's trailer. He talked about how Donkey Kong Racing wouldn't limit the player to a single animal, saying that you would jump between different sized animals with different properties during a race. And when the game was reworked as Saberman Stampede, how many extra features were added to the initial design? Over the course of 18 months, Saberman Stampede went from being strictly a racer to a more open world adventure in the vein of Diddy Kong Racing, and one of the key mechanics of the game would be raising the animals you rode. This mechanic would eventually take center stage as the project continued to evolve, to the point where Musgrave described it as a cute version of Grand Theft Auto set in Africa. Due to lack of focus from the team and the fact that while it had some interesting mechanics, was missing other important features such as a story, the game was eventually cancelled, ending development on what started out as a Donkey Kong themed racer. Musgrave is quoted in another interview saying, "I still look back to the early racing game design and think we could have done something great with that." Shortly after Rare finished work on the GBA port of Donkey Kong Country 3, they thought about making an all-new DKC for the Nintendo DS, as they felt like they had a good amount of experience with handhelds after porting the trilogy. However, it was merely a thought they had, and they decided that making an all-new game on hardware they were still learning about wouldn't be the best idea, choosing to tread familiar ground by porting Diddy Kong Racing instead. Also, considering that Rare was owned by the competition, Nintendo may not have felt comfortable having them revive a franchise they themselves owned. Eventually, Donkey Kong Country 4 would become a reality in the form of Donkey Kong Country Returns, which was released exactly 16 years after the very first DKC. Both games were released in North America on November 21st, and the games that made up the trilogy would also be released in late November. The newest addition to the series, Tropical Freeze, was slated for a November release in 2013, but was pushed back to February 21st of the following year. The release date still holds some significance, however, as 2014 marks the 20th anniversary of the Donkey Kong Country franchise. Did you know? Similar to how Cranky Kong was an aged-up take on the original Donkey Kong, Diddy began as a redesign of Donkey Kong Jr. In 2015, Rare designer Greg Mail shared pictures from a book titled Donkey Kong and the Golden Bananas over Twitter, showing some early concepts for Donkey Kong Country. One page shows Diddy while he was still proposed as an update to Jr., but Nintendo felt this redesign was too different to what came before. They asked Rare to either keep Jr.'s old look or to make this new design an entirely new character. Rare felt the design fit their update to Donkey Kong's world and made him a new Kong. After a few naming attempts, they settled on the name Diddy, a slang term for small in some parts of the UK. Diddy's final design was done by Rare artist Kevin Bayliss, who we reached out to for further details. Bayliss wanted a friendlier looking design in contrast to Donkey Kong's more ill-tempered look. He also gave Diddy a tail so he could grab onto objects or even use it as a spring. Diddy's shirt and hat were added to make him stand out from the greens and browns of the backgrounds and were colored red to match up with DK's tie. The clothing idea also came from a series of UK commercials for T-brand PG Tips, where chimpanzees were dressed in various clothes. The chimps were provided by Twycross Zoo, located very close to Rare, and is also where the team gained inspiration for other DK characters. Diddy was made to serve as a second hit for the player, one that wouldn't get in the way. For Country, the team wanted the game's screen to be as clutter-free as possible. Taking inspiration from Mario's changing in size, Mails said Diddy represented a visual health bar, as well as making the player not feel alone on their journey. As the series progressed, Player 2 became more integral to the gameplay than just soaking up a hit. During development of Donkey Kong Country 2, many names were brainstormed for its potential title. Possible names ranged from Diddy Kong Country and Kremling's The New Batch, to Diddy Kong in Space, even though he's not, and Diddy's Quest for a decent name for his game. The final title became Diddy's Conquest, a pun on the term conquest that also referenced Diddy stepping into the limelight. Many fans mistakenly refer to it as Diddy Kong's Quest, though early footage of the game shows it did take on that title for a short time. Diddy's character design was still receiving some tweaks even at this point. Nintendo veteran Shigeru Miyamoto and some of his staff sent sketches of logo ideas for Diddy and Dixie's hats, though Rare used none of them. Instead, they inscribed the Nintendo logo on Diddy's hat and gave a Rare pin to Dixie. Though Dixie's pin disappeared after Rare was sold to Microsoft, the Nintendo branding has stuck with Diddy to this day. This game also marked the debut of the yellow star pattern on Diddy's shirt, though these changes wouldn't be seen in-game until the Nintendo 64 era. Speaking of the N64, Diddy Kong Racing wasn't a Diddy-centered game until very late in development. In the months leading to its release, the game was known as Pro-Am 64, an indirect update to the RC Pro-Am series that featured Timber the Tiger in the lead role. Banjo-Kazooie was planned to be Rare's big holiday title for 1997, but was delayed to the following summer to reach its full potential. This left Rare in a bit of a bind. Suddenly Pro-Am was their Christmas game, and they weren't sure if the brand was strong enough to grab people's attention. The team decided to rebrand the game using Diddy Kong, though Nintendo gave them the choice to pick either Diddy or Donkey Kong for the lead role. In an interview with Nintendo Life, artist Lee Musgrave said, "Nintendo enjoyed the fact that we chose Diddy Kong over Donkey Kong. I think that it was us trying to build on the fact that Diddy was ours and DK was theirs. The team then changed a few things around to attach it to the new IP better, with Musgrave admitting it was a bit of a rush job. Having little competition in its release window, Diddy Kong Racing was the center of attention for Nintendo's marketing. selling. It sold nearly 5 million copies and stands as one of the top 10 best-selling games for the N64. There were several attempts to create a follow-up to Diddy Kong Racing, with each one failing to release as intended, if at all. Following Rare's sale to Microsoft, Diddy Kong Pilot was retooled to Banjo Pilot, and Donkey Kong Racing was cancelled outright. Later, around April 2004, Studio Climax created a GameCube pitch called Diddy Kong Racing Adventure, a project that wasn't publicly known until November 2016, when gaming archivist Andrew Borman obtained the prototype and published a video on it. Like the original, it would have featured an adventure mode complete with boss battles and multiple vehicle choices. A roster of 14 was planned, and Climax hoped to use the existing cast plus characters from Banjo-Kazooie and Conker. In the event a character was unavailable, a Kong family member would take their place. Each character would have also had their own special moves, such as Timber unleashing a Sonic Wave roar attack and Tip-Top using a ring of turtle shells. Other proposed features included weather plus day and night settings, several multiplayer modes, and the ability to change vehicles mid-race, an idea similar to Donkey Kong Racing's animal mechanic. The prototype was shown to Nintendo, but they passed on it. One likely reason is that the rights to Diddy Kong Racing are split between Nintendo and Rare, and it may have been seen as too much of a legal hassle. Diddy made his debut in the Mario series with Mario Golf Toadstool Tour. He only started appearing in non-Rare Nintendo games after the two companies parted ways, further showing that despite Nintendo's ownership, Diddy was treated as a Rare property. Before then, Donkey Kong Jr. would appear in spin-off games, and it may have stayed that way had Rare not left. Early icons from Mario Kart Double Dash reveal that Jr. was planned for the game before Diddy took his place. Diddy also didn't have his own trophy in Super Smash Bros. Melee, whereas Jr. did, as well as Dixie Kong and King K. Rool. Diddy would later become part of the Smash series, starting with Brawl, making him the first and only Western character to be playable as of Smash Wii U and 3DS. During Rare's time with Donkey Kong, programmer Chris Sutherland provided the voice for Diddy. His samples were reused in several later games, with the most recent being Mario Golf World Tour for 3DS, where they were used alongside Diddy's current voice, Katsumi Suzuki. Diddy Kong is also playable in more Donkey Kong Country games than Donkey Kong himself has been.
Did you know Pikmin was not inspired by Shigeru Miyamoto's garden? Every Nintendo fan has heard the origin story of Pikmin, where Miyamoto was inspired by watching ants in his garden. However, in a 2011 interview on Japanese TV, Miyamoto admitted that wasn't actually true. The ant story was just a marketing gimmick, a simple way of explaining the concept of a completely new type of game. In reality, the creation process was much more complicated. For the first year of Pikmin's development, the game didn't include Pikmin or any creatures resembling ants at all. Instead, it starred two primitive life forms called Adam and Eve, who had a ball for a body, 2 eyes, and a nose. Miyamoto stated, "At the beginning, the idea was just to look at their life. I thought it was an interesting idea. Watch their life was the theme. Give them love or make them fight. Act like God. Depending on the decisions, they could make a nest and have children." Players would watch on as Adam and Eve protected their village from dinosaurs and woolly mammoths. If successful, they'd breed and expand their village. Footage of that early prototype was never made public, but based on the developer's description, it sounds like a prehistoric version of SimCity on a smaller, more intimate scale. The developers eventually broadened the game to focus on 10 or 20 life forms instead of just 2, but Miyamoto still had the Mario 128 tech demo floating around in his imagination, so he ordered for there to be over 100 creatures. The scale grew and grew until the prototype was made up of several villages, with the player wanting as many villagers to survive as possible. But if some died in the struggle, the game would continue. A player character, who later became Olimar, was added as a more interesting way of having a cursor. The creatures who ultimately became the Pikmin were first introduced as weapons the villager used as projectiles. At this point in development, the game wasn't set in a microscopic world. According to Miyamoto, the villagers were comparable to primitive man, and the Pikmin weapons were as big as cats. Eventually, the developers went to Miyamoto's neighborhood to snap photos of forests and caves to use for the game's background, and it was at that point someone suggested they make the villagers behave more like ants. The idea was greenlit, and the game was set on a new trajectory. Eventually, the Pikmin creatures supplanted the villagers, and the project evolved into the game we know today. This is where Miyamoto came up with the fake story about his eureka moment watching ants in his garden. Years later, Miyamoto also admitted he drew some inspiration from Mule, a 1983 Atari game where players use dozens of robotic mules to extract resources from an alien planet. Mule even had mountain wampus players could hunt for extra resources, similar to how iridescent flint beetles in Pikmin reward players with pellets and nectar. At some point in development, Adam and Eve's names were changed to Piki, the Japanese measure word for animals. For example, Japanese people might say, "I have 2 Piki cats," or 3 Piki dogs. When the plant creatures replaced the villagers, they took the name Piki for themselves, but Nintendo ran into complications with the trademark, so they ended up changing the name to Pikmin. There were quite a few changes late in the game's development. Pre-release footage shows Olimar using his whistle to pluck Pikmin out of the ground. But Miyamoto thought the mechanic made harvesting too quick and easy, so he removed it 2 months before the game was finished. However, the whistle pluck feature is still hidden in the game's internal data, and you can even unlock it in the final game using cheat codes. And despite Miyamoto's reservations, the mechanic did eventually make its way into Pikmin 2 as the Pluckaphone. The world originally featured a lot more puzzles, but Miyamoto felt they made Pikmin feel too much like a game rather than a living, breathing world, so he ended up removing a lot of them as well. Multiplayer was originally planned, with Shigeru telling Nintendo Power the original idea was based on Red Pikmin versus Blue Pikmin. A few unfinished 2-player stages can even be found in the game's data. References to a multiplayer option for the main campaign are also hidden in the data, but the mode was never finished. According to Miyamoto, there was another mode that didn't make the cut. In the release version, if the player fails to collect at least 25 ship parts within the 30-day time limit, you get the game's bad ending. With Olimar's oxygen supply down to 0, he's forced to launch his unfinished rocket into space, but takeoff fails and the rocket plummets back down to the Pikmin planet. The bad ending was once meant to trigger a new mode featuring Olimar's ghost, where the player was forced to relive Olimar's memories. Originally, there was going to be more emphasis on replayability, with fans expected to play Pikmin from start to finish several times to experience all 3 endings. But ultimately, Olimar's ghost mode never got made. Instead, it was replaced with a cutscene showing the Pikmin rescuing Olimar from his crashed ship and turning him into a Pikmin. After the game launched in 2001, Miyamoto challenged his team to ride the wave of momentum and develop Pikmin 2 in just a single year. But development ended up taking almost 3 years. The massive delay was partly due to staff being temporarily shifted over to Wind Waker, which was already experiencing delays of its own. But the main reason Pikmin 2 took as long as it did came down to quality control. When Miyamoto stopped by mid-development to see what the developers had made so far, he thought the project was way too similar to Pikmin 1. He was so dissatisfied with the game's quality that he ordered the team to change direction, which had a significant impact on the release date. Just like the first game, the Pikmin team spent some time tinkering with a multiplayer campaign in the sequel, but once again ended up scrapping it. The game's director, Shigefumi Hino, explained why in a 2004 interview, saying, "We did experiment with 2-player gameplay in the campaign, but we came to the conclusion that designing the entire single-player game around the possibility of a second player joining in would put limits on what we could do with the campaign. Ultimately, we decided to implement multiplayer separately by creating verses and cooperative maps. When Pikmin 2 was released around the world, a few dozen treasures were changed in different regions. For example, in Japan, the time capsule had a picture of a cat inside, and the arboreal frippery was changed to a red maple leaf in Europe, probably because some fans mistook the original design for a marijuana leaf. When Pikmin 1 and 2 were re-released on Wii years later, they were updated with new motion controls, graphical enhancements, and an improved save system. But according to Shigefumi Hino, the Pikmin team discussed adding even more enhancements. Additional enhancements could have made the re-releases into something like a Pikmin 1 and 2 Deluxe, but Hino said Nintendo later told the Pikmin team both games should be released on Wii as soon as possible. So updates and enhancements were kept to a minimum. When the original Pikmin was in development, Miyamoto told his team that the next Mario is Pikmin. But after the game's release, sales turned out to be a massive disappointment. It only managed to sell a little over 1 million copies, and Pikmin 2 sold even less than that. For comparison's sake, Mario Sunshine sold over 6 million copies, and even Wind Waker, which Nintendo considered a commercial failure, sold more than 3 million. As a result, Pikmin 3 ended up pretty low on Nintendo's list of priorities. Development on Pikmin 3 consisted of just 5 team members conducting experiments on various hardware, including on Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS. In a 2013 interview, he specifically mentioned a DS prototype that was never made public, although we do have some idea what Pikmin DS looked like because Nintendo filed a patent for it in 2005, about 3 years before Miyamoto announced a new Pikmin game was even in development. The patent shows the player controlling groups of Pikmin by circling them with the stylus, ordering them to kill enemies, and carrying their carcasses back to the onion. The patent also shows Pikmin carrying pellets and mentions picking flowers. In short, it depicts a handheld version of the traditional Pikmin experience. However, Miyamoto described it as a new type of Pikmin game, so it seems there was more to Pikmin DS than what's revealed in the patent. Unfortunately, it was never greenlit for full-scale production. Instead, the handheld Pikmin game fans ended up getting was Hey Pikmin, which didn't even manage to sell 500,000 copies and garnered an average review score of just 69%. After the Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS testing, Miyamoto's team also experimented with Pikmin 3 on 3DS. Then for quite a while, they planned to release the game on Wii, but it wasn't until the Wii U came along that the small team was expanded to around 50 developers. According to Miyamoto, the Wii U's HD resolution was his inspiration to kick production into high gear, since it'd finally show each individual Pikmin with much greater detail. He also said Nintendo franchises like Zelda wouldn't have much to gain on a future 4K console, but 4K could be a huge benefit for the Pikmin series. The more clearly you can see each Pikmin, the more you care about them, and the more anguish you feel when your mistakes get them killed. During Pikmin 3's development, Miyamoto had the debuggers make sure the game could be completed without losing a single Pikmin. In his mind, Pikmin's sort of a mix between F-Zero and Saving Private Ryan, telling Japanese outlet 4Gamer that Pikmin can be more heartbreaking than a war movie. In Saving Private Ryan, a World War II general orders a team of soldiers to march across German-occupied France to save just one man. Several of them die in the process, which Miyamoto likens to the player trekking across PNF 404 at sunset to save one lost Pikmin. Like the general in the film, it's up to the player to decide those types of ethical questions for themselves. Miyamoto also produced the F-Zero series and hopes fans will think of his racing games when they're playing Pikmin 3, competing for the highest scores and quickest times by replaying again and again, especially in mission mode. About 30% of the team's ideas didn't end up making it into the game, like online versus mode. Miyamoto said, "We gave up on that. We wanted to include it in Pikmin 3, but we would have had to make other sacrifices to include it. So we've decided to focus on the single-player and local multiplayer aspects, which are really fun. But unfortunately, no online multiplayer for Pikmin 3. A fourth playable character, codenamed D in concept art shown at E3 2012, was also scrapped. But even before D was created and cut, Miyamoto originally planned to include Olimar. He said, "Actually, when we showed Pikmin 3 at last year's E3, there were 4 captains. But when you have 4 playable characters, it becomes too complicated to switch between them. So in the end, we decided to reduce it to just 3 captains. Even though I made that decision myself, up until the middle of development, I still thought Olimar would be playable." Olimar wasn't a playable character in Pikmin 3 on Wii U, but he did make it back into the game 7 years later, along with Louie in Pikmin 3 Deluxe's side stories. But what about the question fans have been wondering for years? Where is Pikmin 4? When GameSpot asked Miyamoto in 2016, he told them, "When we're in development, we have to create a list of priorities, and it has been hard to kind of fit Pikmin 4 into that list." Then a year later, he told Eurogamer, "I've been told not to share anything about this from PR, but I can tell you it is progressing." After the disappointing sales of Pikmin 1 and 2, a third game was such a low priority, it took Nintendo almost a decade to finish. And just like its predecessors, the third game barely managed to sell 1 million copies. As a result, Pikmin 4 is probably still in its early days, the same way Pikmin 3 spent 5 years with a skeleton crew experimenting with different ideas. With any luck, future hardware with higher resolutions might reignite Miyamoto's enthusiasm, or outstanding sales of Pikmin 3 Deluxe could provide Nintendo justification to devote their resources. Failing those two possibilities, fans eagerly anticipating Pikmin 4 might be in store for another long winter ahead.
Did you know? The original Kid Icarus was almost developed entirely by a single person. Game developer Toru Osawa approached the higher-ups at Nintendo with a proposal for a new action game. Even though Osawa was an unproven rookie, his proposal was approved. Although he had a positive start, Osawa began to feel neglected by his co-workers and ended up creating the game's design document and sprites single-handedly. Yoshio Sakamoto, another designer at Nintendo, finished work on Metroid while Kid Icarus was in development. He returned from vacation to find Osawa alone, slaving away on Kid Icarus in the middle of summer. Realizing that the project stood no chance for meeting its December deadline, Sakamoto brought the Metroid team on board to finish the title. And since both games used the same engine, the Metroid team were a natural fit. The bulk of the game was created during a torturous work cycle spanning several months. Staff members worked around the clock and even slept on cardboard boxes in the office during all-nighters. The building's heating was turned off after business hours to conserve energy, making autumn nights particularly harsh. Osawa also got married during this time and requested 3 days off for his honeymoon, but the game was so far behind schedule that he was called back into work on the second day. Production continued through December and didn't end until just 3 days before the game was planned to release. Despite not considering it complete, Osawa was forced to submit the game for printing. He was simply told, if this doesn't have any bugs, it's finished. The North American version of Kid Icarus was released several months later and received some extra polish. This included a staff role at the end of the game and coloured backgrounds for the game's ending cutscenes. Both versions include the same 4 basic endings where Pit is transformed into various forms ranging from a lowly farmer to a fully fledged angel depending on the player's performance. The US release includes a 5th ending not found in the Japanese version where Pit receives a kiss from the goddess Palutena. Similarly, the Japanese release also features its own 5th ending where Pit is transformed into a speck nose. Kid Icarus was released on the Famicom Disk System in Japan, making it technically superior to the Western version. Most notably, the Disk System version had 3 save slots for players to use, and also tracked high scores. The NES version instead used a password system to save progress. There's a hidden feature in both versions where the player can haggle with the shopkeeper to lower the prices of items. On the Disk System, this was done by talking into the controller's built-in microphone. NES players would instead have to press both the A and B buttons on a second controller. The 3D Classics re-release of Kid Icarus on the Nintendo eShop was based on the Disk System version and included its enhanced features. Several aspects of Kid Icarus's design were inspired by Osawa's own life. The overall setting and enemies came from his interest in Greek mythology, and the Speck-Nose enemy was inspired by the prominent nose of the game's composer, Hirokazu Tanaka. The game's eggplant wizard was spawned from Osawa's own love of eggplants, but was also a reference to the eggplant men in Wrecking Crew. There was also a type of enemy introduced in Kid Icarus known as Komatos, which bear a striking resemblance to Metroids in both design and behavior. The name Komato actually comes from Komitoro Ido, meaning Metroid Child. The game's sequel, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters, was released in 1991 in North America and Europe. However, it wasn't released in Japan until 2012. Japan's first chance to play the game was through the 3DS Virtual Console. Following the release of Myths and Monsters, the series was dormant for almost 20 years. Although no games were published during this time, there was at least one attempt to revive the series. For a year, starting in March 2007, game developers at Factor 5 worked on a grittier, more mature reimagining of the series. The project had the codename Icarus and was planned to be a third-person shooting game with flight combat elements. Little progress was made, and Nintendo was seemingly unsatisfied with the direction Factor 5 were taking and decided against turning Factor 5's project into a full game. After the release of Super Smash Bros. Brawl in 2008, former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata took Brawl's director, Masahiro Sakurai, out for dinner. Iwata revealed that Nintendo had been working on a new handheld system and asked Sakurai to help develop a game to show it off. Sakurai immediately began brainstorming ideas for the game and settled on a concept for a shooter game. He wanted the player to engage in air battles on the way to a destination, which would then turn into a ground battle. Initially conceived as a new franchise, Sakurai wondered if the game should be part of an existing series. Iwata told him to do whatever he pleased, so the decision was made to retool the project as a revival of an older property. One of the franchises Sakurai considered was Star Fox, however he wanted flight to be shown from multiple angles, with the character being able to turn around or even fly sideways. Sakurai felt this dynamic movement didn't fit Star Fox, presumably because the series uses less agile machines and sticks to a single perspective during gameplay. Kid Icarus' story of an angel who couldn't fly seemed to be a perfect fit for his concept of air battles transitioning to land, planned, so the project became Kid Icarus Uprising. Nintendo's new handheld, which would then become the 3DS, was far from finalized at this point, and Sakurai was the first person outside of the company to know of its existence. Because of this, there were no development tools available, and the team started out making the game on PC and even the Wii. Sakurai personally disliked games where story took precedence over gameplay, so in order to ensure development on Uprising went smoothly, he wrote the entire script himself, with every character in the story being designed around their gameplay. The script originally included 3 additional chapters that were scrapped early in development. While he wanted the game to feel fresh, Sakurai also wanted to make it feel part of the Kid Icarus series. He boiled down the series' appeal to 3 main elements: the difficulty, the music, and the silliness of the game's setting. These 3 concepts formed the core principles around which Uprising was designed. Kid Icarus Uprising is known for numerous nods and references throughout the game, but few are harder to find. On the game over screen, for instance, holding down on the D-pad or circle pad will cause an 8-bit Grim Reaper from the original Kid Icarus to appear. And in Chapter 5, there's a level 8 intensity gate that leads to a room with images of a shop from the original Kid Icarus on the walls.
Did you know? The original F-Zero was developed in only 15 months. This relatively short development period was put in place to make sure F-Zero was a Super Nintendo launch title and that the system's pseudo 3D Mode 7 graphics were showcased from day one. A direct sequel to F-Zero was originally planned for the Super Nintendo, but it was cancelled. However, the unfinished sequel was touched up and released exclusively in Japan as BS F-Zero Grand Prix for the Super Nintendo Satellaview add-on. The game featured a new league, along with new tracks like Mute City 4, and introduced 4 new playable vehicles: the Blue Thunder, the Luna Bomber, the Green Amazon, and the Fire Scorpion. An additional sequel called BS F-Zero Grand Prix 2 was also released on the Satellaview and showcased 5 new tracks. There's been a few F-Zero titles that were never released outside of Japan. One example is an expansion kit for the F-Zero X that was released on a Nintendo 64 disk drive. This expansion gave players access to a track editor, a custom vehicle creator, a new cup, and a new soundtrack presented in stereo sound. In addition to this, there were 3 new vehicles to select: the Super Falcon, the Super Stingray, and the Super Cat. These were upgrades of the White Cat, the Fire Stingray, and the Blue Falcon. Though the Nintendo 64 disk drive and its games weren't released in the West, the Super Falcon can be found in the regular F-Zero X ROM files. The vehicle can be accessed using a GameShark device, suggesting that both Nintendo 64 disk drive and the expansion kit were intended for a release outside of Japan at one point. The game was never localized due to the commercial failure of the Nintendo 64 disk drive. A direct sequel to the Game Boy Advance game F-Zero GP Legend was released exclusively in Japan called F-Zero Climax. Like the F-Zero X expansion kit, the game came with a track editor. Climax also introduced 5 new characters who were first seen in the F-Zero anime, which the game itself was based on. The Japanese version of F-Zero GP Legend also came with an e-reader feature, allowing players to scan special cards that were sold separately. The cards let players unlock characters, new tracks, and challenges. This feature was dropped in the Western release of the game, possibly due to the waning popularity of the e-reader. All of the unlockable content was instead made available by completing in-game cups and challenges. There was also an F-Zero game in development for the Virtual Boy called Zero Racers, which was planned to release in fall of 1996. The game was shown at E3 and even had in-game screenshots published in an issue of Nintendo Power. It would have featured 3 circuits, each consisting of 5 tracks and 4 playable vehicles, one of which was the Origami, a completely new vehicle. The game was cancelled, most likely due to the commercial failure of the Virtual Boy. The arcade counterpart of F-Zero GX, F-Zero AX, can be found within the data of F-Zero GX. Although AX isn't playable through conventional means, it can be accessed using a cheat device. A number of unused models can also be found within F-Zero GX's ROM. This includes a flag, a fairly detailed memory card, a pylon, test cones, and a coin. The coin was possibly intended for use within the Casino Palace track. Evidence of 2 unused tracks can also be found in the game's ROM. One of the tracks is labeled AUR and can be only found in the Japanese release. All that remains of the track is a dummy placeholder image, suggesting it was cut early in development. The second track is called Stage 00 and consists of the drivable area from the Screw Drive track with assets from Sand Ocean and the collision data from the Twist Road track. It's unlikely that the track was meant to be playable and was only in the game's code to stop the track viewer from crashing when it tried to load slot 00. One course, which was shown at E3 in 2005 but didn't make it into the game, was a recreation of the track Silence from F-Zero X. In the international releases of of F-Zero GX, many of the stage graphics and backdrops were either altered or blurred, with all the Japanese text swapped over with alien symbols. The venue Casino Palace was originally named Vegas Palace in the Japanese release. The name could have been changed to avoid any connections with the real-life resort city Las Vegas. Multiple vehicles and characters in the series have also been renamed outside of Japan. Mighty Gazelle was originally named MM Gazelle, Octoman was originally called Octman, and the Skull was named Arbin Gordon. Blood Falcon's vehicle, the Bloodhawk, was originally called the Hellhawk. In Maximum Velocity for the Game Boy Advance, the vehicles Windwalker and Sly Joker were originally called Crazy Horse and Dirty Joker in the Japanese release. As the Windwalker's pilot Nietzsche is a Native American, the name could have been changed due to the original name being viewed as racially insensitive. Two characters in F-Zero GP Legend also had their names changed in the West. Ryu Suzaku was changed to Rick Wheeler, and Haruka Misaki's alias Miss Killer was renamed Luna Rider. This was likely done so that the game lines up more closely with the English dub of the F-Zero anime. Multiple characters in the F-Zero series have connections with other Nintendo franchises. Two of these characters are James McCloud and Mr. EAD. James McCloud has a similar appearance to the father of Fox McCloud from the Star Fox series, who is also named James McCloud. His biography reads that he was the leader of a flight squad known as the Galaxy Dog, and that he later converted his combat plane into an F-Zero racer to compete in the Grand Prix. Mr. EAD appears to resemble Nintendo's mascot, Mario, and features his iconic mustache as well as a Starman on his belt. His name comes from Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Division, which was abbreviated simply as EAD. This division of Nintendo also developed most of the main series Mario games, as well as F-Zero and F-Zero X. The character Octoman appears as a boss in Star Fox Command for the Nintendo DS, where he fights alongside the Angler Empire. He is however depicted as having only 4 arms instead of 8. One of the endings for the game also has Fox and Falco entering the G-Zero Grand Prix and converting their ships into G-Zero racers. In both F-Zero and Star Fox, the ships are equipped with G-Diffuser anti-gravity systems. The R-Wing from Star Fox, as well as F-Zero's Blue Falcon and the Fire Stingray, also make cameo appearances in Super Mario RPG. In the Aeropolis venue, a giant Rob the Robot from the Port Town venue can be found hidden inside the outskirts behind the buildings. F-Zero GX also contains multiple references to Sonic the Hedgehog and other Sega franchises, as the game was developed by the Sega-owned developer Amusement Vision. In the bonus ending cinematic for Zoda, Eggman's glasses can be seen on the Mr. EAD Hulk. Eye from the Super Monkey Ball series can be seen on Billy's belt, and PJ's vehicle, the Groovy Taxi, is possibly a reference to the Crazy Taxi series. One event is often cited as a reference, but in fact isn't. Your place on the track is restored by a flying saucer after either falling off the track or getting destroyed. It was previously thought that this saucer was being piloted by Chow. Now that we have access to better tools to examine the game's assets, it's clear that these creatures aren't Chow at all.
Did you know? While official Nintendo consoles found their way into China in the 1980s, often by way of Hong Kong, they were incredibly expensive to Chinese consumers at the time. Consequently, many Chinese fans' first memories of Nintendo began with one of the many Chinese Famicom knockoffs. One of the most popular Famicom bootlegs was the Subor video game system, also known as Hongbaiji, or the Red and White Machine. These clone systems were so prolific that superstar Jackie Chan himself endorsed Subor's line, known as the Little Tyrant. This was a series of computer keyboards marketed to parents as study aids to teach children programming. In spite of this, the Little Tyrants came with built-in Famicom or Super Famicom clone systems, complete with cartridge slots and knockoff controllers. Regardless, Subor held an estimated 80% of the gaming market in China in the 1990s, and with the help of their Famicom clones, they earned revenue upwards of 1 billion won. This model would not last, however. Following parental outcry that video games were destroying the minds of the nation's youth, China's government stepped in and passed the Feedback Regarding the Launch of Special Operation on Video Game Arcades Bill in June 2000. Despite the bill's name seeming to target arcades, it also addressed video game consoles, stating, "The manufacturing and selling of any electronic gaming equipment, plus its parts and accessories headed to China, will be stopped immediately. The import of electronic game equipment plus its parts and accessories through other forms of trade is strictly limited." This ruling forever changed the gaming landscape in China, leading many Chinese consumers to switch to PC gaming in place of consoles. Nevertheless, unlicensed Famicom games continued to be developed and sold through China's black market well into the 2000s. Examples include Harry's Legend, a game loosely based on Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and Final Fantasy VII, a complete 8-bit demake of the PlayStation Classic. Nintendo also refused to give up and decided to bank on a loophole. As it turned out, while Chinese law banned consoles, it didn't specify exactly what a video game console was. Nintendo entered a joint venture with Chinese-American software developer Wei Yen to create the company iQ Limited in order to circumvent regulations. The company released the iQ Player in 2003. To avoid breaking the law, the iQ Player housed all of its hardware within the controller itself and connected directly to the television. This allowed it to be marketed as a handheld plug-and-play gaming system rather than a video game console. Although it was released after the Nintendo GameCube, the iQ Player was essentially a handheld Nintendo 64. The iQ Player sold for just 598 yuan, or roughly $72 at the time. According to late president of Nintendo, Satoru Iwata, this was intentional, stating, "To reach a wide range of people in China, especially those inland who are not as rich as those in coastal areas, we thought we needed to deliver a cheaper console." The iQ Player came pre-installed with Dr. Mario 64 and included demos for Super Mario 64, Star Fox 64, Wave Race 64, and The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. These demos were timed and became permanently locked after running out the clock. In an effort to curb the rampant piracy plaguing China's video game industry, the iQ Player didn't use cartridges whatsoever. To get more games, consumers had to take their iQ Player's rewritable memory card to an iQ Depot kiosk. There, they could purchase and download games for around 48 yuan, or just under $6 each. Later, gamers could also directly connect their iQ Player to the internet and buy games online via the iQ at Home service, similar to Nintendo's Virtual Console. While the card could only hold a limited amount of data at a time, it stored the user's download history, allowing them to re-download purchases free of charge. Allegedly, Nintendo intended to bring more features, such as online multiplayer, to the iQ Player as well, but these plans never materialized. Only 14 games were ultimately released for the iQ Player, from classics like Mario Kart 64 and Paper Mario to more obscure titles like Sin and Punishment and Custom Robo. As each iQ Player was the controller, games such as Super Smash Bros. Could only be played in multiplayer mode through the use of the iQ Family Package. The device essentially served as a multi-tap, allowing up to 3 additional iQ Swim controllers to join in on the fun. The final game released on the iQ Player was Animal Forest, or Animal Crossing as it's best known in the West. The title came out on June 1st, 2006, just over 5 months before the Nintendo Wii's launch in North America. Interestingly, the back of the iQ Player's box featured screenshots of The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, but the game was never officially released in China. As every single game had to be approved by the Chinese government before it could be legally sold, it's speculated Majora's Mask's dark themes may have led to the game being rejected. Estimates vary on how well the iQ Player sold, but it never became the runaway success that Nintendo had hoped. Today, the iQ Player remains something of a collector's item, but it's also used by speedrunners for its quicker scrolling text and load times compared to the original Nintendo 64. This wasn't the only difficulty Nintendo faced within the Chinese market. Although Iwata announced plans to release the Nintendo Wii in China by 2008, the console was never officially released in the country. Whether the Chinese government blocked Nintendo's efforts or Nintendo simply gave up is unknown. Nevertheless, the Wii was popular in China's black market and spawned a host of knockoffs, such as the V, a plug-and-play gaming system marketed as an exercise machine. Nintendo didn't abandon the Chinese market, however, and continued to release special iQ-branded versions of the Game Boy Advance, as well as the SP and Micro. As the GBA systems were handhelds rather than gaming consoles, the iQ Game Boys remained largely unchanged from their Japanese and Western counterparts. Iwata had high expectations for the iQ Game Boy line, and hoped Nintendo could use them to break into the Chinese market within 3 to 4 years. This was not to be, as only 8 games were ever released for the iQ Game Boy in China. That said, evidence exists that more games, such as Mario & Luigi's Superstar Saga, had also been planned for release. Nintendo tried yet again with iQue versions of the Nintendo DS, DS Lite, and DSi. Curiously, while iQue DS games are region-locked, the iQue DS itself can play DS titles from around the world. This is a handy feature, as only 6 iQue DS games were ever released. Oddly enough, a Chinese localized version of Big Brain Academy was featured in trailers for the iQue Lite, but for whatever reason, never made it to the stores. Nintendo waited on the 3DS in China, only releasing an iQue version of the Nintendo 3DS XL. However, the iQue 3DS XL's library fared even worse than the DS, as the only games released for the system were Mario Kart 7 and Super Mario 3D Land, both of which came pre-installed. The system also lacked the ability to access the Nintendo eShop. The iQue 3DS XL was likely hurt by its high price point of 1,699 yuan, or roughly $270, especially in comparison to the Nintendo 3DS XL, which could be purchased in Hong Kong for about $225 and had access to a larger library. In 2014, China officially lifted its ban on video game consoles. While Sony and Microsoft leapt at the chance to officially enter the Chinese market, Nintendo had other ideas. In an announcement that left investors scratching their heads, Iwata stated that rather than release the Wii U in China, Nintendo would develop new machines for the country instead. Iwata declared, "We want to make new things with new thinking rather than a cheaper version of what we currently have. The product and price balance must be made from scratch." Meanwhile, then President of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, remained neutral on the matter. When asked if the Wii U would ever make it to China, Reggie replied, "China certainly is a market we're looking hard at. In order to be effective in China, you need the government to have a posture that is encouraging of our form of entertainment. You need a value proposition that makes sense for the consumer base. And thirdly, you need content that's going to appeal to the consumer base. When you see that we've got all three, we'll be in a market like China." Sadly, nothing came to fruition, and neither the Wii U nor a new iQue system have been released in China. The Big N hasn't given up on China, though. In a bizarre move, Nintendo partnered with Nvidia and iQIYI to bring a selection of Wii titles to the Nvidia Shield in China in late 2017. Chinese gamers could experience Super Mario Galaxy, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, and Punch-Out in 1080p for 68 yuan, or $10 each. Rather than port the games to the Nvidia Shield directly, Nintendo and Nvidia created their own Wii emulator instead. Digital Foundry writer Thomas Morgan praised the emulator as a long way beyond what the excellent Dolphin achieves. Nintendo really knows its own hardware, and has clearly collaborated closely with Nvidia in getting this release to run as well as it does. In spite of Nintendo's efforts, their Nvidia Shield games only managed to sell a combined 22,761 copies as of March 2019. In comparison, these games sold over 51 million copies combined worldwide on the Wii. More recently, the iQue website was quietly updated to re-describe the company as an official subsidiary of Nintendo focused on handling the development and localization of Nintendo's Switch games. After this and other mounting evidence, Nintendo's current president Shuntaro Furukawa officially announced a partnership with Tencent Holdings Limited to release the Switch in China. Furukawa isn't as optimistic as Iwata once was, admitting, "In the past, our dedicated video game systems like the Nintendo DS and Nintendo 3DS were sold in China under the brand of iQue Limited, but we cannot say these were a great success. With that in mind, we decided to work closely with Tencent to do business in China. We recognize that the Chinese market is vast and attractive, but looking forward, we don't expect our video game business in China to easily expand. This is not a short-term plan, but something we want to work on steadily over multiple years." Since then, local officials in the Chinese province of Guangdong have approved Tencent's request to sell the Switch with a test version of New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. News of this development caused Nintendo's stock to soar, but it remains to be seen if the Switch's wild popularity in the rest of the world will translate to China.
Did you know? Nintendo was developing a Fire Emblem game for the Nintendo 64 disk drive simply titled Fire Emblem 64. Shigeru Miyamoto confirmed in an interview that work was progressing on the game and that it would most likely release after Mario RPG 2 in the latter half of 1998. It took until that time, however, for the game to be officially announced. By August of 2000, a different game titled Fire Emblem Maiden of Darkness appeared on listings for Nintendo's Space World event, only months before Fire Emblem 64 was cancelled. Maiden of Darkness would release as Fire Emblem The Sword of Seals, but whether or not these two games are related is unknown. It's possible that assets from Fire Emblem 64 were used in Fire Emblem Path of Radiance for the GameCube, as suggested by early unpolished screenshots. That said, an even more complex theory exists regarding the disappearance of Fire Emblem 64. Around the release of the fifth game in the franchise, Fire Emblem Thracia 776, series creator Shozao Kaga left Intelligent Systems to create his own company, Tighe. Their first game would be Emblem Saga, a successor to the Fire Emblem series for the PlayStation. However, just before the game's release, the title was changed to Tighe Saga, and the in-game emblem items were left unused, though they remain in the game's code. While these changes were likely implemented to avoid a lawsuit from Nintendo, the lawsuit came anyway, and Tighe had to pay a hefty fine for violating the law of unfair competition, a law which protects against the unauthorized use of intangible assets not protected by trademark or copyright laws. As a result of these events and their chronological proximity, it's speculated that the cancellation of Fire Emblem 64 and Tighe Saga are linked. Although many assume Fire Emblem came to the West thanks to Martha Roy's appearance in Super Smash Bros. Melee boosting the series' popularity, it was also due to the success of Advance Wars. In an interview with Edge magazine, the director of Advance Wars, Kentaro Nishimura, stated, "It seems that Advance Wars shifted Nintendo's attitude over Western taste. This is understandable, as both games have similar strategy elements and presentation." The first game in the series to come to the West was Fire Emblem on the Game Boy Advance. This game, which was actually the 7th in the series, began the trend of making Western releases of Fire Emblem a bit easier than the original Japanese versions. In the Japanese release of Fire Emblem, titled Fire Emblem Blazing Sword, players can link up to a copy of Fire Emblem The Sword of Seals. If the games are linked, Lin's story, which serves as a sort of tutorial and prologue, can be skipped. The Sword of Seals was never released outside of Japan, so this wasn't an option for Western players. For them, Lin's story is mandatory. Along with that, many of the game's bosses had their stats slightly lowered overall. In the next game, Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones, some of the characters had increased growth rates as well as base stats. Then in Fire Emblem Path of Radiance, the base stats of some units are boosted as well, and the Maniac difficulty is removed entirely and replaced with an easy difficulty easier than the normal difficulty of both games. Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, however, disposed of this trend and included the normal, hard, and Maniac difficulties, but named them easy, normal, and hard in the Western release, a decision which might have led to the critical complaints about the game's difficulty. On the subject of difficulty, Fire Emblem Awakening came with a bit of controversy over the inclusion of Casual Mode, a mode of play which removed the permanent character death the series was known for. Just as it was among fans, the inclusion was heavily debated within Intelligent Systems. In an interview, Fire Emblem Awakening's project manager, Masahiro Higuchi, stated that he was on the side that we shouldn't include Casual Mode to the end. However, Awakening wasn't the first Fire Emblem game to feature Casual Mode. It was introduced in the Japan-only release, Fire Emblem New Mystery of the Emblem Heroes of Light and Shadow. It's likely that this mode was included as Intelligent Systems was faced with the possibility of Fire Emblem Awakening being the final installation in the series. Due to the declining sales of recent games in the series, Fire Emblem Awakening would be the last game in the franchise if it didn't sell at least 250,000 copies. In response to this, the developers wanted to include as many features as they could, such as downloadable content, marriage, children, a player avatar, and the return of Casual Mode. Having the game take place in the modern-day, real-world setting was even suggested, but dismissed for fear of alienating longtime fans. The game has sold over 1 million copies worldwide to date and broken several previous sales records for the franchise. In Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, Raisin, Lian, and Volug speak an ancient tongue as demonstrated by a unique font to represent their dialogue. The text is in all English despite how intricate the font looks, so the character's dialogue can be easily translated. This language can also be found in the background of some of the menus in Path of Radiance, which when translated read, "Doubt that the stars are fire, doubt that the sun does not move, doubt truth to be a liar, but never doubt I love." This is a direct quote from Hamlet's love poem to Ophelia from Shakespeare's Hamlet. Fire Emblem Path of Radiance contains quite a bit of cut and hidden content. There's a set of icons from the Super Nintendo and GBA games in its data. Despite the game being on the GameCube, the icons are from Genealogy of the Holy War Anon, but don't have the same palette as it did in those games. Path of Radiance is unrelated to any previous Fire Emblem game, so it's likely that these icons were merely placeholders. Path of Radiance also features featured the ability to link up to Fire Emblem the Sword of Seals in the same fashion that the Blazing Swords did, but had to disable it in the Western releases for the same reason. The character illustrations from the Sword of Seals are still in the game's data, but cannot be accessed without cheat codes. While stats for many of the NPCs who appear in Path of Radiance can be found via cheat codes, there is also a set of stats for a character named Heather who does not appear in Path of Radiance, but is playable in Radiant Dawn. Fire Emblem contains an impressive amount of references to various mythologies, historical figures, and geographical locations. Marth, from the storylines which take place on the fictional continent of Urchinea, is named after Mars, the Roman god of war. In the continent of Yggdrasil, the setting for genealogy of the Holy War and Thracia 776, virtually every character and location is based on Norse and Celtic mythology. Yggdrasil itself is derived from Yggdrasil, known as the World Tree in Norse mythology. During the desperate development period for Fire Emblem Awakening, the developers entertained the idea of taking the story to the planet Mars, but Higuchi swiftly shot the idea down. This was perhaps a result of the references to Roman mythology in previous titles. The release of Super Smash Bros. Melee helped finalize Marth's name in the West, but not before a Fire Emblem anime featuring a Prince Mars was released in Japan in 1996. The anime is based on the third game, Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem, and only consists of 2 episodes. A dubbed and subtitled version of the anime was released in America in 1997, 6 years before the first Fire Emblem game would see the same treatment. It's thanks to this anime that Japanese voice actor for Prince Mars, Hikaru Midorikawa, now does the voice of Marth in the Super Smash Bros. Series as well.